A General History of the Pyrates. By Mary Read and Bonny. A General History of the Pyrates, from their first rise and settlement in the island of Providence. Introduction. The Pyrates in the West Indies have been so formidable and numerous, that they have interrupted the trade of Europe into those parts. And our English merchants, in particular, have suffered more by their depredations, than by the united force of France and Spain, in the late war. We do not doubt but the world will be curious to know the original and progress of these desperadoes, who were the terror of the trading part of the world. But before we enter upon their particular history, it will not be amiss, by way of introduction, to shew, by some examples drawn from history, the great mischief and danger which threaten kingdoms and commonwealths, from the increase of these sort of robbers. When either by the troubles of particular times, or the neglect of governments, they are not crushed before they gather strength. It has been the case heretofore, that when a single pirate has been suffered to range the seas, as not being worth the notice of a government, he has by degrees grown so powerful, as to put them to the expense of a great deal of blood and treasure, before he was suppressed. We shall not examine how it came to pass, that our pirates in the West Indies have continually increased till of late. This is an inquiry which belongs to the legislature, or representatives of the people in Parliament, and to them we shall leave it. Our business shall be briefly to shew, what from beginnings, as inconsiderable as these, other nations have suffered. In the times of Marius and Sylla, Rome was in her greatest strength, yet she was so torn in pieces by the factions of those two great men, that everything which concerned the public good was altogether neglected. When certain pirates broke out from Sicilia, a country of Asia Minor, situate on the coast of the Mediterranean, betwixt Syria on the east, from whence it is divided by Mount Taurus, and Armenia Minor on the west. This beginning was mean and inconsiderable, having but 2 or 3 ships, and a few men, with which they cruised about the Greek islands, taking such ships as were very ill armed or weakly defended. However, by the taking of many prizes, they soon increased in wealth and power. The first action of theirs which made a noise, was the taking of Julius Caesar, who was as yet a youth, and who being obliged to fly from the cruelties of Sylla, who sought his life, went into Bithynia, and sojourned a while with Nicomedes, king of that country. In his return back by sea, he was met with, and taken, by some of these pirates, near the island of Pharmacusa. These pirates had a barbarous custom of tying their prisoners back to back and throwing them into the sea. But, supposing Caesar to be some person of a high rank, because of his purple robes, and the number of his attendants, they thought it would be more for their profit to preserve him, in hopes of receiving a great sum for his ransom. Therefore they told him he should have his liberty, provided he would pay them 20 talents, which they judged to be a very high demand, in our money, about £3,600 sterling. He smiled, and of his own accord promised them 50 talents. They were both pleased, and surprised at his answer, and consented that several of his attendants should go by his direction and raise the money. And he was left among these ruffians with no more than 3 attendants. He passed 38 days, and seemed so little concerned or afraid, that often when he went to sleep, he used to charge them not to make a noise, threatening, if they disturbed him, to hang them all. He also played at dice with them, and sometimes wrote verses and dialogues, which he used to repeat, and also caused them to repeat, and if they did not praise and admire them, he would call them beasts and barbarians, telling them he would crucify them. They took all these as the sallies of a juvenile humor, and were rather diverted, than displeased at them. At length his attendants returned with his ransom, which he paid, and was discharged. He sailed for the port of Miletum, where, as soon as he was arrived, he used all his art and industry in fitting out a squadron of ships, which he equipped and armed at his own charges. And sailing in quest of the pirates, he surprised them as they lay at anchor among the islands, and took those who had taken him before, with some others. The money he found upon them he made prize of, to reimburse his charges, and he carried the men to Pergamus or Troy, and there secured them in prison. In the meantime, he applied himself to Junius, then governor of Asia, to whom it belonged to judge and determine of the punishment of these men. But Junius, finding there was no money to be had, answered Caesar, that he would think at his leisure, what was to be done with those prisoners. Caesar took his leave of him, returned back to Pergamus, and commanded that the prisoners should be brought out and executed, according to law in that case provided. Which is taken notice of, in a chapter at the end of this book, concerning the laws in cases of piracy, and thus he gave them that punishment in earnest, which he had often threatened them with in jest. Caesar went straight to Rome, where, being engaged in the designs of his own private ambition, as were almost all the leading men in Rome, the pirates who were left, had time to increase to a prodigious strength. For while the civil wars lasted, the seas were left unguarded, so that Plutarch tells us, that they erected diverse arsenals full of all manner of warlike stores, made commodious harbors. Set up watchtowers and beacons all along the coasts of Cilicia. That they had a mighty fleet, well equipped and furnished, with galleots of oars, manned, not only with men of desperate courage, but also with expert pilots and mariners. They had their ships of force, and light pinnaces for cruising and making discoveries, in all no less than 1,000 sail, so gloriously set out, that they were as much to be envied for their gallant shew, as feared for their force. Having the stern and quarters all gilded with gold and their oars plated with silver, as well as purple sails, as if their greatest delight had been to glory in their iniquity. Nor were they content with committing piracies and insolencies by sea, they committed as great depredations by land, or rather made conquests. For they took and sacked no less than 400 cities, laid several others under contributions, plundered the temples of the gods, and enriched themselves with the offerings deposited in them. They often landed bodies of men, who not only plundered the villages along the sea coast, but ransacked the fine houses of the noblemen along the Tiber. A body of them once took Sextilius and Bellinus, 2 Roman praetors, in their purple robes, going from Rome to their governments, and carried them away with all their sergeants, officers and vergers. They also took the daughter of Antonius, a consular person, and one who had obtained the honor of a triumph, as she was going to the country house of her father. But what was most barbarous, was a custom they had when they took any ship, of inquiring of the person on board, concerning their names and country. If any of them said he was a Roman, they fell down upon their knees, as if in a fright at the greatness of that name, and begged pardon for what they had done, and imploring his mercy, they used to perform the offices of servants about his person. And when they found they had deceived him into a belief of their being sincere, they hung out the ladder of the ship, and coming with a shew of courtesy, told him, he had his liberty, desiring him to walk out of the ship. And this in the middle of the sea, and when they observed him in surprise, as was natural, they used to throw him overboard with mighty shouts of laughter. So wanton they were in their cruelty. Thus, while Rome was mistress of the world, she suffered insults and affronts, almost at her gates, from these powerful robbers. But what for a while made faction cease, and roused the genius of that people, never used to suffer wrongs from a fair enemy, was an excessive scarcity of provisions in Rome, occasioned by all the ships loaden with corn and provisions from Sicily, Corsica, and other places, being intercepted and taken by these pirates, insomuch that they were almost reduced to a famine. Upon this, Pompey the Great was immediately appointed general to manage this war. 500 ships were immediately fitted out, he had 14 senators, men of experience in the war, for his vice-admirals. And so considerable an enemy, were these ruffians become, that no less than an army of 100,000 foot, and 5,000 horse was appointed to invade them by land. But it happened very luckily for Rome, that Pompey sailed out before the pirate had intelligence of a design against them, so that their ships were scattered all over the Mediterranean, like bees gone out from a hive, some one way, some another, to bring home their lading. Pompey divided his fleet into 13 squadrons, to whom he appointed their several stations, so that great numbers of the pirates fell into their hands, ship by ship, without any loss. 40 days he passed in scouring the Mediterranean, some of the fleet cruising along the coast of Africa, some about the islands, and some upon the Italian coasts, so that often those pirates who were flying from one squadron, fell in with another. However, some of them escaped, and these making directly to Cilicia, and acquainting their confederates on shore with what had happened, they appointed a rendezvous of all the ships that had escaped at the port of Coricesium, in the same country. Pompey, finding the Mediterranean quite clear, appointed a meeting of all his fleet at the haven of Brundusium, and from thence sailing round into the Adriatic, he went directly to attack these pirates in their hives. As soon as he came near the Coracesium in Cilicia, where the remainder of the pirates now lay, they had the hardiness to come and give him battle, but the genius of old Rome prevailed, and the pirates received an entire overthrow, being all either taken or destroyed. But as they made many strong fortresses upon the sea coast, and built castles and strong holds up the country, about the foot of Mount Taurus, he was obliged to besiege them with his army. Some places he took by storm, others surrendered to his mercy, to whom he gave their lives, and at length he made an entire conquest. But it is probable, that had these pirates received sufficient notice of the Roman preparation against them, so as they might have had time to draw their scattered strength into a body, to have met Pompey by sea, the advantage appeared greatly on their side, in numbers of shipping, and of men. Nor did they want courage, as may be seen by their coming out of the port of Coracesium, to give the Romans battle, with a force much inferior to theirs. I say, had they overthrown Pompey, it is likely they would have made greater attempts, and Rome, which had conquered the whole world, might have been subdued by a parcel of pirates. This is a proof how dangerous it is to governments to be negligent, and not take an early care in suppressing these sea banditti, before they gather strength. The truth of this maxim may be better exemplified in the history of Barbaroius, a native in the city of Mytilene, in the island of Lesbos, in the Aegean Sea. A fellow of ordinary birth, who being bred to the sea, first set out from thence upon the pirating account with only one small vessel, but by the prizes he took, he gained immense riches, so that getting a great number of large ships, all the bold and dissolute fellows of those islands flocked to him, and listed in his service, for the hopes of booty. So that his strength was increased to a formidable fleet, with these he performed such bold and adventurous actions, that he became the terror of the seas. About this time it happened that Selim Utimi, king of Algiers, having refused to pay the accustomed tribute to the Spaniards, was apprehensive of an invasion from thence. Wherefore he treated with Barbaroius, upon the foot of an ally, to come and assist him, and deliver him from paying this tribute. Barbaroius readily came into it, and sailing to Algiers with a great fleet, he put part of his men on shore, and having laid a plot to surprise the city, he effected it with great success, and murdered Selim in a bath. Soon after which, he was himself crowned king of Algiers. After this he made war upon Abdelabd, king of Tunis, and overthrew him in battle. He extended his conquests on all sides, and thus from a thief became a mighty king, and though he was at last killed in battle, yet he had so well established himself upon that throne, that, dying without issue, he left the inheritance of the kingdom to his brother, another pirate. I come now to speak of the pirates infesting the West Indies, where they are more numerous than in any other parts of the world, on several reasons. First, because there are so many uninhabited little islands and keys, with harbors convenient and secure for cleaning their vessels, and abounding with what they often want, provision. I mean water, seafowl, turtle, shell, and other fish, where, if they carry in but strong liquor, they indulge a time, and become ready for new expeditions before any intelligence can reach to hurt them. It may here perhaps be no unnecessary digression, to explain upon what they call keys in the West Indies. These are small sandy islands, appearing a little above the surf of the water, with only a few bushes or weeds upon them. But abound, those most at any distance from the main, with turtle, amphibious animals, that always choose the quietest and most unfrequented place, for laying their eggs, which are to a vast number in the seasons, and would seldom be seen but for this, except by pirates. Then vessels from Jamaica and the other governments make voyages, called turtling, for supplying the people, a common and approved food with them. I am apt to think these keys, especially those nigh islands, to have been once contiguous with them, and separated by earthquakes, frequently there, or inundations, because some of them that have been within continual view, as those nigh Jamaica, are observed within our time, to be entirely wasted away and lost, and others daily wasting. There are not only of the use above taken notice of to pirates, But it is commonly believed were always in buccaneering piratical times, the hiding places for their riches, and oftentimes a shelter for themselves, till their friends on the main, had found means to obtain indemnity for their crimes. For you must understand, when acts of grace were more frequent, and the laws less severe, these men continually found favors and encouragers at Jamaica, and perhaps they are not all dead yet. I have been told many of them still living have been of the same trade, and left it off only because they can live as well honestly, and gain now at the hazard of others' necks. Secondly, another reason why these seas are chose by pirates, is the great commerce thither by French, Spaniards, Dutch, and especially English ships. They are sure in the latitude of these trading islands, to meet with prizes, booties of provision, clothing, and naval stores, and sometimes money. There being great sums remitted this way to England, the returns of the afiento, and private slave trade, to the Spanish West Indies. And in short, by some one or other, all the riches of Potosi. A third reason, is the inconveniency and difficulty of being pursued by the men of war, the many small inlets, lagoons and harbors, on these solitary islands and keys, is a natural security. 'Tis generally here that the pirates begin their enterprises, setting out at first with a very small force. And by infesting these seas, and those of the continent of North America, in a year's time, if they have good luck on their sides, they accumulate such strength, as enables them to make foreign expeditions. The first, is usually to Guinea, taking the Azores and Cape de Verde Islands in their way, and then to Brazil and the East Indies, where if they meet with prosperous voyages, they set down at Madagascar, or the neighboring islands, and enjoy their ill-gotten wealth among their elder brethren, with impunity. But that I may not give too much encouragement to the profession, I must inform my maritime readers, that the far greater part of these rovers are cut short in the pursuit, by a sudden precipitation into the other world. The rise of these rovers, since the Peace of Utrecht, or at least, the great increase of them, may justly be computed to the Spanish settlements in the West Indies. The governors of which, being often some hungry courtiers, sent thither to repair or make a fortune, generally countenance all proceedings that bring in profit. They grant commissions to great numbers of vessels of war, on pretence of preventing an interloping trade, with orders to seize all ships or vessels whatsoever, within 5 leagues of their coasts, which our English ships cannot well avoid coming, in their voyage to Jamaica. But if the Spanish captains chance to exceed this commission, and rob and plunder at discretion, the sufferers are allowed to complain, and exhibit a process in their court, and after great expense of suit, delay of time, and other inconveniencies, obtain a decree in their favor. But then when the ship and cargo comes to be claimed, with costs of suit, they find, to their sorrow, that it has been previously condemned, and the plunder divided among the crew. The commander that made the capture, who alone is responsible, is found to be a poor rascally fellow, not worth a groat, and, no doubt, is plagued in that station for the like purposes. The frequent losses sustained by our merchants abroad, by these pirates, was provocation enough to attempt something by way of reprisal. And a fair opportunity offering itself in the year 1716, the traders of the West Indies, took care not to slip it over, but made the best use of it their circumstances would permit. It was about 2 years before, that the Spanish galleons, or plate fleet, had been cast away in the Gulf or Florida, and several vessels from the Havana, were at work, with diving engines, to fish up the silver that was on board the galleons. The Spaniards had recovered some millions of pieces of 8, and had carried it all to the Havana, but they had at present about 350,000 pieces of 8 in silver, then upon the spot, and were daily taking up more. In the meantime, 2 ships, and 3 sloops, fitted out from Jamaica, Barbados, and under Captain Henry Jennings, sailed to the Gulf, and found the Spaniards there upon the wreck. The money before spoken of, was left on shore, deposited in a storehouse, under the government of 2 commissaries, and a guard of about 60 soldiers. The rovers came directly upon the place, bringing their little fleet to an anchor, and, in a word, landing 300 men, they attacked the guard, who immediately ran away. And thus they seized the treasure, which they carried off, making the best of their way to Jamaica. In their way they unhappily met with a Spanish ship, bound from Porto Bello to the Havana, with a great many rich goods, viz. Bales of cochineal, casks of indigo, and 60,000 pieces of 8 more, which their hands being in, they took, and having rifled the vessel, let her go. They went away to Jamaica with their booty, and were followed in view of the port, by the Spaniards, who having seen them thither, went back to the governor of the Havana, with the account of it. Who immediately sent a vessel to the governor of Jamaica to complain of this robbery, and to reclaim the goods. As it was in full peace, and contrary to all justice and right, that this fact was committed, they were soon made sensible that the government at Jamaica would not suffer them to go unpunished, much less protect them. Therefore they saw a necessity of shifting for themselves, so, to make bad worse, they went to sea again, though not without disposing of their cargo to good advantage and furnishing themselves with ammunition, provisions, and being thus made desperate, they turned pirates, robbing not the Spaniards only, but their own countrymen, and any nation they could lay their hands on. It happened about this time, that the Spaniards, with 3 or 4 small men of war, fell upon our logwood cutters, in the Bay of Campeche, and Bay or Honduras. And after they had made prizes of the following ships and vessels, they gave the men belonging to them 3 sloops to carry them home, but these men being made desperate by their misfortunes, and meeting with the pirates, they took on with them. And so increased their number. The list of ships and vessels taken by the Spanish men of war in the year 1716. The Stafford, Captain Knox, from New England, bound for London. Anne, Gurnish, for ditto. Dove, Grimstone, for New England. A sloop, Alden, for ditto. A brigantine, Mawson, for ditto. A brigantine, Turfield, for ditto. A brigantine, Tennis, for ditto. A ship, Porter, for ditto. Indian Emperor, Wentworth, for New England. A ship, Rich, master. Ditto, Bay. Ditto, Smith. Ditto, Stockham. Ditto, Satterley. A sloop, Richards, belonging to New England. 2 sloops, belonging to Jamaica. 1 sloop, of Barbados. 2 ships, from Scotland. 2 ships, from Holland. The rovers being now pretty strong, they consulted together about getting some place of retreat, where they might lodge their wealth, clean and repair their ships, and make themselves a kind of abode. They were not long in resolving, but fixed upon the island of Providence, the most considerable of the Bahama Islands, lying in the latitude of about 24 degrees north, and to the eastward of the Spanish Florida. This island is about 28 miles long, and 11 were broadest, and has a harbor big enough to hold 500 sail of ships, before which lies a small island, which makes 2 inlets to the harbor. At either way there is a bar, over which no ship of 500 ton can pass. The Bahama Islands were possessed by the English till the year 1700, when the French and Spaniards from Petit Guavas invaded them, took the fort and governor in the island of Providence, plundered and destroyed the settlements, and carried off half the blacks, and the rest of the people, who fled to the woods, retired afterwards to Carolina. In March 1705-6, the House of Lords did in an address to Her late Majesty, set forth that the French and Spaniards had twice, during the time of the war, overrun and plundered the Bahama Islands. That there was no form of government there, that the harbor of the Isle of Providence might be easily put in a posture of defense, and that it would be of dangerous consequence, should those islands fall into the hands of the enemy. Wherefore the Lords humbly besought Her Majesty to use such methods as she should think proper for taking the said island into her hands, in order to secure the same to the crown of this kingdom, and to the security and advantage of the trade thereof. But, however it happened, no means were used in compliance to that address, for securing the Bahama Islands, till the English pirates had made Providence their retreat and general receptacle. Then 'twas found absolutely necessary, in order to dislodge that troublesome colony. And information being made by the merchants to the government, of the mischief they did, and were likely to do, His Majesty was pleased to grant the following order. Whitehall, September 15, 1716. Complaint having been made to His Majesty, by great number of merchants, masters of ships and others, as well as by several governors of His Majesty's islands and plantations in the West Indies, that the pirates are grown so numerous, that they infest not only the seas near Jamaica, but even those of the northern continent of America. And that, unless some effectual means be used, the whole trade from Great Britain to those parts, will not be only obstructed, but in imminent danger of being lost. His Majesty has, upon mature deliberation in council, been pleased, in the first place, to order a proper force to be employed for the suppressing the said pirates, which force so to be employed, is as follows. A list of His Majesty's ships and vessels employed, and to be employed, at the British governments and plantations in the West Indies. Place where. Rates. Ships. Guns. Jamaica. Adventure. Now there. Diamond. Sailed from hence thither 5th of last month. Ludlow Castle. To carry the governor. Swift sloop. Now there. Winchelsea. Surveying the coast of the West Indies, and then to return home. But, during her being at Jamaica, is to join the others, for security of the trade, and intercepting pirates. Barbados. Scarborough. Now there. Leeward Islands. Seaford. Now there. Trial sloop. Virginia. Lyme. Now there. Shoreham. Ordered home. Pearl. Sailed thither from home the 7th of last month, and is to cruise about the Capes. New York. Phoenix. Now there. New England. Squirrel. Rose. Ordered home. Those at Jamaica, Barbados, and the Leeward Islands, are to join upon occasion, for annoying the pirates, and the security of the trade, and those at New England, Virginia, and New York, are to do the like. Besides these frigates, 2 men of war were ordered to attend Captain Rogers, late commander of the 2 Bristol ships, called the Duke and Duchess, that took the rich Acapulco ship, and made a tour round the globe. This gentleman received a commission from His Majesty, to be governor of the island of Providence, and was vested with power to make use of all possible methods for reducing the pirates. And that nothing might be wanting, he carried with him, the King's proclamation of pardon, to those who should return to their duty by a certain time. The proclamation is as follows. By the King. A proclamation, for suppressing of pirates. George R. Whereas we have received information, that several persons, subjects of Great Britain, have since the 24th day of June, in the year of our Lord 1715, committed divers piracies and robberies upon the high seas, in the West Indies, or adjoining to our plantations, which hath and may occasion great damage to the merchants of Great Britain, and others trading into those parts. And though we have appointed such a force as we judge sufficient for suppressing the said pirates, yet the more effectually to put an end to the same, we have thought fit, by and with the advice of our Privy Council, to issue this our royal proclamation. And we do hereby promise, and declare, that in case any of the said pirates, shall on or before the 5th of September, in the year of our Lord 1718, surrender him or themselves, to one of our principal secretaries of state in Great Britain or Ireland, or to any governor or deputy governor of any of our plantations beyond the seas, every such pirate and pirates so surrendering him, or themselves, as aforesaid, shall have our gracious pardon, of and for such, his, or their piracy, or piracies, by him or them committed before the 5th of January next ensuing. And we do hereby strictly charge and command all our admirals, captains, and other officers at sea, and all our governors and commanders of any forts, castles, or other places in our plantations, and all other our officers civil and military, to seize and take such of the pirates, who shall refuse or neglect to surrender themselves accordingly. And we do hereby further declare, that in case any person or persons, on, or after, the 6th day of September 1718, shall discover or seize, or cause or procure to be discovered or seized, any one or more of the said pirates, so refusing or neglecting to surrender themselves as aforesaid, so as they may be brought to justice, and convicted of the said offense, such person or persons, so making such discovery or seizure, or causing or procuring such discovery or seizure to be made, shall have and receive as a reward for the same, viz. For every commander of any private ship or vessel, the sum of 100 for every lieutenant, master, boatswain, carpenter, and gunner, the sum of 40 for every inferior officer, the sum of 30 and for every private man, the sum of 20 And if any person or persons, belonging to and being part of the crew of any such pirate ship or vessel, shall on or after the said 6th day of September 1718, seize and deliver, or cause to be seized or delivered, any commander or commanders of such pirate ship or vessel, so as that he or they be brought to justice, and convicted of the said offense, such person or persons, as a reward for the same, shall receive for every such commander, the sum of 200 Which said sums, the Lord Treasurer, or the Commissioners of our Treasury for the time being, are hereby required, and desired to pay accordingly. Given at our court, at Hampton Court, the 5th day of September, 1717, in the 4th year of our Regan. God save the King. Before Governor Rogers went over, the proclamation was sent to them, which they took as Teague took the covenant, that is, they made prize of the ship and proclamation too. However, they sent for those who were out a-cruising, and called a general council, but there was so much noise and glamour, that nothing could be agreed on. Some were for fortifying the island, to stand upon their own terms, and treating with the government upon the foot of a commonwealth. Others were also for strengthening the island for their own security, but were not strenuous for these punctilios, so that they might have a general pardon, without being obliged to make any restitution, and to retire, with all their effects, to the neighboring British plantations. But Captain Jennings, who was their commodore, and who always bore a great sway among them, being a man of good understanding, and good estate, before this whim took him of going a-pirating, resolved upon surrendering, without more ado, to the terms of the proclamation, which so disconcerted all their measures, that the Congress broke up very abruptly without doing anything. And presently Jennings, and by his example, about 150 more, came in to the governor of Bermudas, and had their certificates, though the greatest part of them returned again, like the dog to the vomit. The commanders who were then in the island, besides Captain Jennings above mentioned, I think were these, Benjamin Hornigold, Edward Teach, John Martel, James Fife, Christopher Winter, Nicholas Brown, Paul Williams, Charles Bellamy, Oliver LaBouche, Major Penner, ed. England, T. Burgess, though Coughlin, R. Sample, Charles Vane, and 2 or 3 others, Hornigold, Williams, Burgess and LaBouche were afterwards cast away, Teach and Penner killed, and their crews taken, James Fife killed by his own men. Martel's crew destroyed, and he forced on an uninhabited island, Coughlin, Sample and Vane hanged, Winter and Brown surrendered to the Spaniards at Cuba, and England lives now at Madagascar. In the month of May or June 1718, Captain Rogers arrived at his government, with 2 of his Majesty's ships, and found several of the above-said pirates there, who upon the coming of the men of war, all surrendered to the pardon. Except Charles Vane and his crew, which happened after this manner. I have before described the harbour to have 2 inlets, by means of a small island lying at the mouth of it. At one of which, both the men of war entered, and left the other open, so that Vane slipped his cable, set fire to a large prize they had there, and resolutely put out, firing at the man of war as he went off. As soon as Captain Rogers had settled himself in his government, he built a fort for his defence, and garrisoned it with the people he found upon the island. The quondam pirates, to the number of 400, he formed into companies, appointed officers of those whom he most confided in, and then set about to settle a trade with the Spaniards, in the Gulf of Mexico. In one of which voyages, Captain Burgess above mentioned, died, and Captain Hornigold, another of the famous pirates, was cast away upon rocks, a great way from land, and perished, but 5 of his men got into a canoe and were saved. Captain Rogers sent out a sloop to get provisions, and gave the command to one John Augur, one of the pirates, who had accepted of the act of grace. In their voyage they met with 2 sloops, and John and his comrades, not yet forgetting their former business, made use of their old freedom, and took out of them in money and goods, to the value of about 500 L. After this they steered away for Hispaniola, not being satisfied whether the governor would admit them to carry on 2 trades at once, and so thought to have bidden farewell to the Bahama Islands. But as ill luck would have it, they met with a violent tornado, wherein they lost their mast, and were drove back to one of the uninhabited Bahamas, and lost their sloop. The men got all ashore, and lived up and down in the wood, for a little time, till Governor Rogers happening to hear of their expedition, and where they had got to, sent out an armed sloop to the aforesaid island. The master of which, with good words and fair promises, got them on board, and brought them all to Providence, being 11 persons, 10 of which were tried at a court of admiralty, convicted, and hanged by the others' evidence, in the sight of all their former companions and fellow thieves. The criminals would fain have spirited up the pardoned pirates, to rescue them out of the hands of the officers of justice, telling them from the gallows, that, they never thought to have seen the time when 10 such men as they should be tied up and hanged like dogs, and 400 of their sworn friends and companions quietly standing by to behold the spectacle. One Humphrey Morris urged the matter further than the rest, taxing them with pusillanimity and cowardice, as if it were a breach of honor in them not to rise and save them from the ignominious death they were going to suffer. But 'twas all in vain. They were now told, it was their business to turn their minds to another world, and sincerely to repent of what wickedness they had done in this. Yes, answered one of them, I do heartily repent. I repent I had not done more mischief, and that we did not cut the throats of them that took us, and I am extremely sorry that you a'n't all hanged as well as we. So do I, says another, and I, says a third. And then they were all turned off, without making any other dying speeches, except one Dennis McCarty, who told the people, that some friends of his had often said he should die in his shoes, but that he would make them liars. And so kicked them off. And thus ended the lives, with their adventures, of those miserable wretches, who may serve as sad examples of the little effect mercy has upon men once abandoned to an evil course of life. Lest I be thought severe in my animadversions upon the Spanish proceedings in the West Indies, in respect to their dealings with us, I shall mention an instance or two, wherein I'll be as concise as possible, and then transcribe some original letters from the governor of Jamaica, and an officer of a man of war, to the alcaldes of Trinidado, on the island of Cuba, with their answers, translated into English, and then proceed to the particular histories of the pirates and their crews, that have made most noise in the world in our own times. About March 1722, one of our men of war trading upon the coast, viz. the Greyhound galley, Captain Walron, the said captain invited some of the merchants to dinner, who with their attendants and friends came on board to the number of 16 or 18 in all. And having concerted measures, about 6 or 8 dined in the cabin, and the rest were waiting on the deck. While the captain and his guests were at dinner, the boatswain pipes for the ship's company to dine. Accordingly the men take their platters, receive their provisions, and down they go between decks, leaving only 4 or 5 hands besides the Spaniards, above, who were immediately dispatched by them, and the hatches laid on the rest. Those in the cabin were as ready as their companions, for they pulled out their pistols and shot the captain, surgeon and another dead, and grievously wounded the lieutenant. But he getting out of the window upon a side ladder, thereby saved his life, and so they made themselves masters of the ship in an instant, but by accidental good fortune, she was recovered before she was carried off. For Captain Walron having manned a sloop with 30 hands out of his ship's company, had sent her to windward some days before, also for trade, which the Spaniards knew very well. And just as the action was over they saw this sloop coming down, before the wind, towards their ship, upon which the Spaniards took about 10,000 L, in specie, as I am informed, quitted the ship, and went off in their launch unmolested. About the same time, a guard la coast, of Puerto Rico, commanded by one Matthew Luke, an Italian, took 4 English vessels, and murdered all the crews. He was taken by the Launceston man of war, in May 1722, and brought to Jamaica, where they were all but 7 deservedly hanged. It is likely the man of war might not have meddled with her, but that she blindly laid the Launceston on board, thinking she had been a merchant ship, who thereupon catched a Tartar. Afterwards in rummaging there was found a cartridge of powder made up with a piece of an English journal, belonging, I believe, to the Queen Snow. And upon examination, at last, it was discovered that they had taken this vessel and murdered the crew, and one of the Spaniards, when he came to die, confessed that he had killed 20 English men with his own hands. S. Iago de la Vega, Fabre. 20. A letter from His Excellency Sir Nicholas Laws, our Governor, to the Alcaldes of Trinidado. On Cuba, dated the 26th of January 1721 to 2. Gentlemen. The frequent depredations, robberies, and other acts of hostility, which have been committed on the King my royal master's subjects, by a parcel of banditti, who pretend to have commissions from you, and in reality are sheltered under your government, is the occasion of my sending the bearer Captain Chamberlain, Commander of His Majesty's Snow Happy, to demand satisfaction of you for so many notorious robberies which your people have lately committed on the King's subjects of this island, particularly by those traitors, Nicholas Brown and Christopher Winter, to whom you have given protection. Such proceedings as these are not only a breach of the law of nations, but must appear to the world of a very extraordinary nature, when considered that the subjects of a prince in amity and friendship with another should give countenance and encourage such vile practices. I confess I have had long patience, and declined using any violent measures to obtain satisfaction, hoping the cessation of arms, so happily concluded upon between our respective sovereigns, would have put an effectual stop to those disorders. But on the contrary, I now find the port of Trinidado a receptacle to villains of all nations. I do therefore think fit to acquaint you, and assure you in the King my master's name, that if I do meet with any of your rogues for the future upon the coast of this island, I will order them to be hanged directly without mercy. And I expect and demand of you to make ample restitution to Captain Chamberlain or all the negroes which the said Brown and Winter have lately taken off from the north side of this island. And also of such sloops and other effects as they have been taken and robbed of, since the cessation of arms, and that you will deliver up to the bearer such English men as are now detained, or otherwise remain at Trinidado. And also expect you will hereafter forbear granting any commissions, or suffer any such notorious villains to be equipped and fitted out from your port, otherwise you may depend upon it, those that I can meet with, shall be esteemed pirates, and treated as such. Of which I thought proper to give you notice, and am, and a letter from Mr. Joseph Laws, Lieutenant of His Majesty's ship, Happy Snow, to the Alcaldes of Trinidado. Gentlemen, I am sent by Commodore Vernon, Commander-in-Chief of all His Majesty's ships in the West Indies to demand in the King our Master's name, all the vessels, with theirs effects, and also the negroes taken from Jamaica since the cessation of arms. Likewise all Englishmen now detained, or otherwise remaining in your port of Trinidado, particularly Nicholas Brown and Christopher Winter, both of them being traitors, pirates and common enemies to all nations, and the said Commodore hath ordered me to acquaint you, that he is surprised that the subjects of a prince in amity and friendship with another, should give countenance to such notorious villains. In expectation of your immediate compliance, I am, gentlemen, off the river Trinidado. February 8th. 1720. Your humble servant, Joseph Laws. The answer of the Alcaldes of Trinidado, to Mr. Laws's letter. Captain Laws. I in answer to yours, this serves to acquaint you, that neither in this city, nor port, are there any negroes or vessels which have been taken at your island of Jamaica, nor on that coast, since the cessation of arms. And what vessels have been taken since that time, have been for trading in an unlawful commerce on this coast. And as for those English fugitives you mention, they are here as other subjects of our Lord the King, being brought voluntarily to our holy Catholic faith, and have received the water of baptism. But if they should prove rogues, and should not comply with their duty, in which they are bound at present, then they shall be chastised according to the ordinances of our King, whom God preserve. And we beg you will weigh anchor as soon as possible, and leave this port and its coasts, because upon no account you shall be suffered to trade, or anything else, for we are resolved not to admit thereof. God preserve you. We kiss your hand. Trinidado. February 8, 1722. Signed, Hieronimo de Fuentes. Benet Alfonso del Manzano. Mr. Laws's reply to the alcalde's letter. Gentlemen, your refusing to deliver up the subjects of the king my master, is somewhat surprising, it being in a time of peace, and the detaining them consequently against the law of nations. Notwithstanding your trifling pretense, for which you have no foundation but to forge an excuse, to prevent my making any inquiry into the truth of the facts I have alleged in my former, I must tell you my resolutions are to stay on the coast till I have made reprisals. And should I meet any vessels belonging to your port, I shall not treat them as the subjects of the crown of Spain, but as pirates, finding it a part of your religion in this place to protect such villains. Off the river Trinidado. February 8. 1720. Your humble servant. Joseph Laws. The answer of one of the alcaldes to Mr. Laws's. Reply. Captain Laws. You may assure yourself, I will never be wanting in the duty of my post. The prisoners that are here are not in prison, but only kept here to be sent to the governor of the Havana. If you, as you say, command at sea, I command on shore. If you treat the Spaniards, you should happen to take, as pirates. I will do the same by every one of your people I can take up. I will not be wanting to good manners, if you will do the same. I can likewise act the soldier, if any occasion should offer that way, for I have very good people here for that purpose. If you pretend anything else, you may execute it on this coast. God preserve you. I kiss your hand. Trinidado. February 20. 1720. Signed. Benet Alfonso del Manzano. The last advices we have received from our plantations in America, dated June 9, 1724, gives us the following account, viz. That Captain Jones in the ship John and Mary, on the 5th of the said month, met with, near the Capes of Virginia, a Spanish guard del coast, commanded by one Don Benito. Said to be commissioned by the governor of Cuba, she was manned with 60 Spaniards, 18 Frenchmen and 18 English, and had an English captain as well as Spanish, one Richard Holland, who formerly belonged to the Suffolk man of war, which he deserted at Naples, and took shelter in a convent. He served on board the Spanish fleet under Admiral Camac, in the war in the Mediterranean, and after the cessation of arms with Spain, settled with several of his countrymen, Irish, in the Spanish West Indies. This guard del coast made prize of Captain Jones's ship, and kept possession of her from 5th to the 8th, during which time she took also the prudent Hannah of Boston, Thomas Mazel master, and the Dolphin of Topsham, Theodore Bear master. Both laden and bound for Virginia, the former they sent away together with 3 men and the mate, under the command of a Spanish officer and crew, the same day she was taken. The latter they carried off with them, putting the master and all the crew aboard Captain Jones's ship. They plundered Captain Jones of 36 men slaves, some gold dust, all his clothes, for great guns and small arms, and about 400 gallons of rum, besides his provisions and stores, computed in all to 1,500 sterling. Chapter 1. Of Captain Avery and his crew. None of these bold adventurers were ever so much talked of, for a while, as Avery. He made as great a noise in the world as Merivale does now, and was looked upon to be a person of as great consequence. He was represented in Europe, as one that had raised himself to the dignity of a king, and was likely to be the founder of a new monarchy. Having, as it was said, taken immense riches, and married the great Mogul's daughter, who was taken in an Indian ship, which fell into his hands, and that he had by her many children, living in great royalty and state. That he had built forts, erected magazines, and was master of a stout squadron of ships, manned with able and desperate fellows of all nations. That he gave commissions out in his own name to the captains of his ships, and to the commanders of his forts, and was acknowledged by them as their prince. A play was writ upon him, called, The Successful Pirate. And, these accounts obtained such belief, that several schemes were offered to the council for fitting out a squadron to take him, while others were for offering him and his companions an act of grace, and inviting them to England, with all their treasure, lest his growing greatness might hinder the trade of Europe to the East Indies. Yet all these were no more than false rumors, improved by the credulity of some, and the humor of others who loved to tell strange things, for, while it was said, he was aspiring at a crown, he wanted a shilling. And at the same time it was given out he was in possession of such prodigious wealth in Madagascar, he was starving in England. No doubt, but the reader will have a curiosity of knowing what became of this man, and what were the true grounds of so many false reports concerning him. Therefore, I shall, in as brief a manner as I can, give his history. He was born in the west of England near Plymouth in Devonshire. Being bred to the sea, he served as a mate of a merchantman, in several trading voyages. It happened before the peace of Rifwick, when there was an alliance betwixt Spain, England, Holland, and against France, that the French in Martinico, carried on a smuggling trade with the Spaniards on the continent of Peru, which by the laws of Spain, is not allowed to friends in time of peace. For none but native Spaniards are permitted to traffic in those parts, or set their feet on shore, unless at any time they are brought as prisoners. Wherefore they constantly keep certain ships cruising along the coast, whom they call Guarda del Costa, who have the orders to make prizes of all ships they can light of within 5 leagues of land. Now the French growing very bold in trade, and the Spaniards being poorly provided with ships, and those they had being of no force, it often fell out, that when they light of the French smugglers, they were not strong enough to attack them. Therefore it was resolved in Spain, to hire 2 or 3 stout foreign ships for their service, which being known at Bristol, some merchants of that city, fitted out 2 ships of 30-odd guns, and 120 hands each, well furnished with provision and ammunition, and all other stores. And the hire being agreed for, by some agents for Spain, they were commanded to sail for Corunna or the Groin, there to receive their orders, and to take on board some Spanish gentlemen, who were to go passengers to New Spain. Of one of these ships, which I take to be called the Duke, Captain Gibson commander, Avery was first mate, and being a fellow of more cunning than courage, he insinuated himself into the goodwill of several of the boldest fellows on board the other ship, as well as that which he was on board of. Having sounded their inclinations before he opened himself, and finding them ripe for his design, he, at length, proposed to them, to run away with the ship, telling them what great wealth was to be had upon the coasts of India. It was no sooner said than agreed to, and they resolved to execute their plot at 10 o'clock the night following. It must be observed, the captain was one of those who are mightily addicted to punch, so that he passed most of his time on shore, in some little drinking ordinary, but this day he did not go on shore as usual. However, this did not spoil the design, for he took his usual dose on board, and so got to bed before the hour appointed for the business. The men also who were not privy to the design, turned into their hammocks, leaving none upon deck but the conspirators, who, indeed, were the greatest part of the ship's crew. At the time agreed on, the Duchess's longboat appeared, which Avery hailing in the usual manner, was answered by the men in her, "Is your drunken boatswain on board?" Which was the watchword agreed between them, and Avery replying in the affirmative, the boat came aboard with 16 stout fellows, and joined the company. When our gentry saw that all was clear, they secured the hatches, so went to work. They did not slip the anchor, but waited leisurely, and so put to sea without any disorder or confusion, though there were several ships then lying in the bay, and among them a Dutch frigate of 40 guns. The captain of which was offered a great reward to go out after her. But Mynheer, who perhaps would not have been willing to have been served so himself, could not be prevailed upon to give such usage to another, and so let Mr. Avery pursue his voyage, whither he had a mind to. The captain, who by this time, was awaked either by the motion of the ship, or the noise of working the tackles, rung the bell. Avery and 2 others went into the cabin. The captain, half asleep, and in a kind of fright, asked, what was the matter? Avery answered coolly, nothing. The captain replied, something's the matter with the ship. Does she drive? What weather is it? Thinking nothing less than that it had been a storm, and that the ship was driven from her anchors. No, no, answered Avery, we're at sea, with a fair wind in good weather. At sea? Says the captain, how can that be? Come, says Avery, don't be in a fright, but put on your clothes, and I'll let you into a secret. You muse know, that I am captain of this ship now, and this is my cabin, therefore you must walk out. I am bound to Madagascar, with a design of making my own fortune, and that of all the brave fellows joined with me. The captain, having a little recovered his senses, began to apprehend the meaning. However, his fright was as great as before, which Avery perceiving, bade him fear nothing, for, says he, if you have a mind to make one of us, we will receive you, and if you'll turn sober, and mind your business. Perhaps in time I may make you one of my lieutenants, if not, here's a boat alongside, and you shall be set ashore. The captain was glad to hear this, and therefore accepted of his offer, and the whole crew being called up, to know who was willing to go on shore with the captain, and who to seek their fortunes with the rest. There were not above 5 or 6 who were willing to quit this enterprise, wherefore they were put into the boat with the captain that minute, and made their way to the shore as well as they could. They proceeded on their voyage to Madagascar, but I do not find they took any ships in their way. When they arrived at the N.E. part of that island, they found 2 sloops at anchor, who, upon seeing them, slipped their cables and run themselves ashore, the men all landing, and running into the woods. These were 2 sloops which the men had run away with from the West Indies, and seeing Avery, they supposed him to be some frigate sent to take them, and therefore not being of force to engage him, they did what they could to save themselves. He guessed where they were, and sent some of his men on shore to let them know they were friends, and to offer they might join together for their common safety. The sloop's men were well armed, and had posted themselves in a wood, with sentinels just on the outside, to observe whether the ship landed her men to pursue them, and they observing only 2 or 3 men to come towards them without arms, did not oppose them, but having challenged them, and they answering they were friends, they lead them to their body, where they delivered their message. At first, they apprehended it was a stratagem to decoy them on board, but when the ambassadors offered that the captain himself, and as many of the crew as they should name, would meet them on shore without arms, they believed them to be in earnest. And they soon entered into a confidence with one another. Those on board going on shore, and some of those on shore going on board. The sloop's men were rejoiced at the new ally, for their vessels were so small, that they could not attack a ship of any force, so that hitherto they had not taken any considerable prize, but now they hoped to fly at high game. And Avery was as well pleased at this reinforcement, to strengthen them, for any brave enterprise, and though the booty must be lessened to each, by being divided into so many shares, yet he found out an expedient not to suffer by it himself, as shall be shown in its place. Having consulted what was to be done, they resolved to sail out together upon a cruise, the galley and 2 sloops. They therefore fell to work to get the sloops off, which they soon effected, and steered towards the Arabian coast. Near the river Indus, the man at the masthead spied a sail, upon which they gave chase, and as they came nearer to her, they perceived her to be a tall ship, and fancied she might be a Dutch East Indiaman homeward bound. But she proved a better prize. When they fired at her to bring to, she hoisted Mogul's colors, and seemed to stand upon her defense. Avery only cannonaded at a distance, and some of his men began to suspect that he was not the hero they took him for. However, the sloops made use of their time, and coming one on the bow, and the other on the quarter, of the ship, clapped her on board, and entered her, upon which she immediately struck her colors and yielded. She was one of the great Mogul's own ships, and there were in her several of the greatest persons of his court, among whom it was said was one of his daughters, who were going on a pilgrimage to Mecca. The Mohammedans, thinking themselves obliged once in their lives to visit that place, and they were carrying with them rich offerings to present at the shrine of Mahomet. It is known that the Eastern people travel with the utmost magnificence, so that they had with them all their slaves and attendants, their rich habits and jewels, with vessels of gold and silver, and great sums of money to defray the charges of their journey by land. Wherefore the plunder got by this prize, is not easily computed. Having taken all the treasure on board their own ships, and plundered their prize of everything else they either wanted or liked, they let her go. She, not being able to continue her voyage, returned back. As soon as the news came to the Mogul, and he knew that they were English who had robbed them, he threatened loud, and talked of sending a mighty army with fire and sword to extirpate the English from all their settlements on the Indian coast. The East India Company in England were very much alarmed at it. However, by degrees, they found means to pacify him, by promising to do their endeavors to take the robbers, and deliver them into his hands. However, the great noise this thing made in Europe, as well as India, was the occasion of all these romantic stories which were formed of Avery's greatness. In the meantime our successful plunderers agreed to make the best of their way back to Madagascar, intending to make that place their magazine or repository for all their treasure, and to build a small fortification there, and leave a few hands always ashore to look after it, and defend it from any attempts of the natives. But Avery put an end to this project, and made it altogether unnecessary. As they were steering their course, as has been said, he sends a boat on board of each of the sloops, desiring the chief of them to come on board of him, in order to hold a council. They did so, and he told them he had something to propose to them for the common good, which was to provide against accidents. He bade them consider the treasure they were possessed of, would be sufficient for them all if they could secure it in some place on shore, therefore all they had to fear, was some misfortune in the voyage. He bade them consider the consequences of being separated by bad weather, in which case, the sloops, if either of them should fall in with any ships of force, must be either taken or sunk, and the treasure on board her lost to the rest. Besides the common accidents of the sea. As for his part, he was so strong, he was able to make his party good with any ship they were like to meet in those seas, that if he met with any ship of such strength, that he could not take her, he was safe from being taken, being so well manned. Besides, his ship was a quick sailer, and could carry sail, when the sloops could not, wherefore, he proposed to them, to put the treasure on board his ship, to seal up each chest with 3 seals, whereof each was to keep one, and to appoint a rendezvous, in case of separation. Upon considering this proposal, it appeared so seasonable to them, that they readily came into it, for they argued to themselves, that an accident might happen to one of the sloops and the other escape, wherefore it was for the common good. The thing was done as agreed to, the treasure put on board of Avery, and the chest sealed. They kept company that day and the next, the weather being fair, in which time Avery tampered with his men, telling them they now had sufficient, to make them all easy, and what should hinder them from going to some country where they were not known, and living on shore all the rest of their days in plenty. They understood what he meant, and in short, they all agreed to bilk their new allies, the sloop's men, nor do I find that any of them felt any qualms of honor rising in his stomach, to hinder them from consenting to this piece of treachery. In fine, they took advantage of the darkness that night, steered another course, and, by morning, lost sight of them. I leave the reader to judge, what swearing and confusion there was among the sloop's men, in the morning, when they saw that Avery had given them the slip. For they knew by the fairness of the weather, and the course they had agreed to steer, that it must have been done on purpose, but we leave them at present to follow Mr. Avery. Avery, and his men, having consulted what to do with themselves, came to a resolution, to make the best of their way towards America. And none of them being known in those parts, they intended to divide the treasure, to change their names, to go ashore, some in one place, some in other, to purchase some settlements, and live at ease. The first land they made, was the island of Providence, then newly settled. Here they stayed some time, and having considered that when they should go to New England, the greatness of their ship, would cause much inquiry about them. And possibly some people from England, who had heard the story of a ship's being run away with from the Groyne, might suspect them to be the people. They therefore took a resolution of disposing of their ship at Providence, upon which, Avery pretending that the ship being fitted out upon the privateering account, and having had no success, he had received orders from the owners to dispose of her to the best advantage, he soon met with a purchaser, and immediately bought a sloop. In this sloop, he and his companions embarked. They touched at several parts of America, where no person suspected them. And some of them went on shore, and dispersed themselves about the country, having received such dividends as Avery would give them. For he concealed the greatest part of the diamonds from them, which in the first hurry of plundering the ship, they did not much regard, as not knowing their value. At length he came to Boston, in New England, and seemed to have a desire of settling in those parts, and some of his companions went on shore there also, but he changed his resolution, and proposed to the few of his companions who were left to sail for Ireland, which they consented to. He found out that New England was not a proper place for him, because a great deal of his wealth lay in diamonds. And should he have produced them there, he would have certainly been seized on suspicion of piracy. In their voyage to Ireland, they avoided St. George's Channel, and sailing north about, they put into one of the northern ports of that kingdom. There they disposed of their sloop, and coming on shore they separated themselves, some going to Cork, and some to Dublin, 18 of whom obtained their pardons afterwards of K. William. When Avery had remained some time in this kingdom, he was afraid to offer his diamonds to sale, lest an inquiry into his manner of coming by them should occasion a discovery. Therefore, considering with himself what was best to be done, he fancied there were some persons at Bristol, whom he might venture to trust, upon which, he resolved to pass over into England. He did so, and going into Devonshire, he sent to one of these friends to meet him at a town called Biddeford. When he had communicated himself to his friends, and consulted with him about the means of his effects, they agreed, that the safest method would be, to put them in the hands of some merchants, who being men of wealth and credit in the world, no inquiry would be made how they came by them. This friend telling him he was very intimate with some who were very fit for the purpose, and if he would but allow them a good commission would do the business very faithfully. Avery liked the proposal, for he found no other way of managing his affairs, since he could not appear in them himself. Therefore his friend going back to Bristol, and opening the matter to the merchants, they made Avery a visit at Biddeford, where, after some protestations of honor and integrity, he delivered them his effects, consisting of diamonds and some vessels of gold. They gave him a little money for his present subsistence, and so they parted. He changed his name and lived at Biddeford, without making any figure, and therefore there was no great notice taken of him. Yet let one or two of his relations know where he was, who came to see him. In some time his little money was spent, yet he heard nothing from his merchants. He writ to them often, and after much importunity they sent him a small supply, but scarce sufficient to pay his debts. In fine, the supplies they sent him from time to time, were so small, that they were not sufficient to give him bread. Nor could he get that little, without a great deal of trouble and importunity, wherefore being weary of his life, he went privately to Bristol, to speak to the merchants himself, where instead of money he met a most shocking repulse. For when he desired them to come to an account with him, they silenced him by threatening to discover him, so that our merchants were as good pirates at land as he was at sea. Whether he was frightened by these menaces, or had seen somebody else he thought knew him, is not known. But he went immediately over to Ireland, and from thence solicited his merchants very hard for a supply, but to no purpose, for he was even reduced to beggary. In this extremity he was resolved to return and cast himself upon them, let the consequence be what it would. He put himself on board a trading vessel, and worked his passage over to Plymouth, from whence he travelled on foot to Biddeford, where he had been but a few days before he fell sick and died, not being worth as much as would buy him a coffin. Thus have I given all that could be collected of any certainty concerning this man. Rejecting the idle stories which were made of his fantastic greatness, by which it appears, that his actions were more inconsiderable than those of other pirates, since him, though he made more noise in the world. Now we shall turn back and give our readers some account of what became of the two sloops. We took notice of the rage and confusion, which must have seized them, upon their missing of Avery. However, they continued their course, some of them still flattering themselves that he had only outsailed them in the night, and that they should find him at the place of rendezvous, but when they came there, and could hear no tidings of him, there was an end of hope. It was time to consider what they should do with themselves. Their stock of sea provision was almost spent, and though there was rice and fish, and fowl to be had ashore, yet these would not keep for sea, without being properly cured with salt, which they had no conveniency of doing. Therefore, since they could not go a cruising any more, it was time to think of establishing themselves at land. To which purpose they took all things out of the sloops, made tents of the sails, and encamped themselves, having a large quantity of ammunition, and abundance of small arms. Here they met with several of their countrymen, the crew of a privateer sloop which was commanded by Captain Thomas Tew, and since it will be but a short digression, we will give an account how they came here. Captain George Dew and Captain Thomas Tew, having received commissions from the then governor of Bermudas, to sail directly for the river Gambia in Africa. There, with the advice and assistance of the agents of the Royal African Company, to attempt the taking the French factory at Guri, lying upon that coast. In a few days after they sailed out, Dew in a violent storm, not only sprung his mast, but lost sight of his consort. Dew therefore returned back to refit, and Tew, instead of proceeding on his voyage, made for the Cape of Good Hope, and doubling the said cape, shaped his course for the Straits of Bab el Mandeb, being the entrance into the Red Sea. Here he came up with a large ship, richly laden, bound from the Indies to Arabia, with 300 soldiers on board, besides seamen, yet Tew had the hardiness to board her, and soon carried her. And, 'tis said, by this prize, his men shared near £3,000 apiece. They had intelligence from the prisoners, of 5 other rich ships to pass that way, which Tew would have attacked, though, they were very strong, if he had not been overruled by the quartermaster and others. This differing in opinion created some ill blood amongst them, so that they resolved to break up pirating, and no place was so fit to receive them as Madagascar. Hither they steered, resolving to live on shore and enjoy what they got. As for Tew himself, he with a few others in a short time went off to Rhode Island, from whence he made his peace. Thus have we accounted for the company our pirates met with here. It must be observed that the natives of Madagascar are a kind of Negroes. They differ from those of Guinea in their hair, which is long, and their complexion is not so good a jet. They have innumerable little princes among them, who are continually making war upon one another. Their prisoners are their slaves, and they either sell them, or put them to death, as they please. When our pirates first settled amongst them, their alliance was much courted by these princes, so they sometimes joined one, sometimes another. But wheresoever they sided, they were sure to be victorious. For the Negroes here had no firearms, nor did they understand their use. So that at length these pirates became so terrible to the Negroes, that if 2 or 3 of them were only seen on one side, when they were going to engage, the opposite side would fly without striking a blow. By these means they not only became feared, but powerful. All the prisoners of war, they took to be their slaves. They married the most beautiful of the Negro women, not 1 or 2, but as many as they liked. So that every one of them had as great a seraglio as the Grand Seignior at Constantinople. Their slaves they employed in planting rice, in fishing, hunting, and besides which, they had abundance of others, who lived, as it were, under their protection, and to be secure from the disturbances or attacks of their powerful neighbors, these seemed to pay them a willing homage. Now they began to divide from one another, each living with his own wives, slaves and dependents, like a separate prince. And as power and plenty naturally beget contention, they sometimes quarreled with one another, and attacked each other at the head of their several armies, and in these civil wars, many of them were killed. But an accident happened, which obliged them to unite again for their common safety. It must be observed that these sudden great men, had used their power like tyrants, for they grew wanton in cruelty, and nothing was more common, than upon the slightest displeasure, to cause one of their dependents to be tied to a tree and shot through the heart. Let the crime be what it would, whether little or great, this was always the punishment. Wherefore the Negroes conspired together, to rid themselves of these destroyers, all in one night. And as they now lived separate, the thing might easily have been done, had not a woman, who had been wife or concubine to one of them, run near 20 miles in 3 hours. To discover the matter to them, immediately upon the alarm they ran together as fast as they could, so that when the Negroes approached them, they found them all up in arms. Wherefore they retired without making any attempt. This escape made them very cautious from that time, and it will be worth while to describe the policy of these brutish fellows, and to shew what measures they took to secure themselves. They found that the fear of their power could not secure them against a surprise, and the bravest man may be killed when he is asleep, by one much his inferior in courage and strength, therefore, as their first security. They did all they could to foment war betwixt the neighboring negroes, remaining neuter themselves, by which means, those who were overcome constantly lied to them for protection, otherwise they must be either killed or made slaves. They strengthened their party, and tied some to them by interest. When there was no war, they contrived to spirit up private quarrels among them, and upon every little dispute or misunderstanding, push on one side or other to revenge. Instruct them how to attack or surprise their adversaries, and lend them loaded pistols or firelocks to dispatch them with. The consequence of which was, that the murderer was forced to fly to them for the safety of his life, with his wives, children and kindred. Such as these were fast friends, as their lives depended upon the safety of his protectors. For as we observed before, our pirates were grown so terrible, that none of their neighbors had resolution enough to attack them in an open war. By such arts as these, in the space of a few years, their body was greatly increased. They then began to separate themselves, and remove at a greater distance from one another, for the convenience of more ground, and were divided like Jews into tribes, each carrying with him his wives and children, of which, by this time they had a large family, as also their quota of dependents and followers. And if power and command be the thing which distinguish a prince, these ruffians had all the marks of royalty about them, nay more, they had the very fears which commonly disturb tyrants. As may be seen by the extreme caution they took in fortifying the places where they dwelt. In this plan of fortification they imitated one another. Their dwellings were rather citadels than houses. They made choice of a place overgrown with wood, and situate near a water. They raised a rampart or high ditch round it, so straight and high, that it was impossible to climb it, and especially by those who had not the use of scaling ladders. Over this ditch there was one passage into the wood. The dwelling, which was a hut, was built in that part of the wood which the prince, who inhabited it, thought fit, but so covered that it could not be seen till you came at it. But the greatest cunning lay in the passage which led to the hut, which was so narrow, that no more than one person could go abreast, and contrived in so intricate a manner, that it was a perfect maze or labyrinth, it being round and round, with several little cross ways, so that a person that was not well acquainted with the way, might walk several hours round and cross these ways without being able to find the hut. Moreover, all along the sides of these narrow paths, certain large thorns which grew upon a tree in that country, were struck into the ground with their points uppermost, and the path itself being made crooked and serpentine. If a man should attempt to come near the hut at night, he would certainly have struck upon these thorns, though he had been provided with that clue which Ariadne gave to Theseus when he entered the cave of the Minotaur. Thus tyrant-like they lived, fearing and feared by all. And in this situation they were found by Captain Woodes Rogers, when he went to Madagascar, in the Delicia, a ship of 40 guns. With a design of buying slaves in order to sell to the Dutch at Batavia or New Holland, he happened to touch upon a part of the island, where no ship had been seen for 7 or 8 years before, where he met with some of the pirates. At which time, they had been upon the island above 25 years, having a large motley generation of children and grandchildren descended from them, there being about that time, 11 of them remaining alive. Upon their first seeing a ship of this force and burthen, they supposed it to be a man of war sent to take them. They therefore lurked within their fastnesses, but when some from the ship came on shore, without any shew of hostility, and offering to trade with the negroes, they ventured to come out of their holes, attended like princes. And since they actually are kings de facto, which is a kind of a right, we ought to speak of them as such. Having been so many years upon this island, it may be imagined, their clothes had long been worn out, so that their majesties were extremely out at the elbows. I cannot say they were ragged, since they had no clothes, they had nothing to cover them but the skins of beasts without any tanning, but with all the hair on, nor a shoe nor stocking, so they looked like the pictures of Hercules in the lion's skin. And being overgrown with beard, and hair upon their bodies, they appeared the most savage figures that a man's imagination can frame. However, they soon got rigged, for they sold great numbers of those poor people under them, for clothes, knives, saws, powder and ball, and many other things, and became so familiar that they went aboard the Delicia. And were observed to be very curious, examining the inside of the ship, and very familiar with the men, inviting them ashore. Their design in doing this, as they afterwards confessed, was to try if it was not practicable to surprise the ship in the night, which they judged very easy, in case there was but a slender watch kept on board. They having boats and men enough at command, but it seems the captain was aware of them, and kept so strong a watch upon deck, that they found it was in vain to make any attempt. Wherefore, when some of the men went ashore, they were for inveigling them, and drawing them into a plot, for seizing the captain and securing the rest of the men under hatches, when they should have the night watch. Promising a signal to come on board to join them. Proposing, if they succeeded, to go a pirating together, not doubting but with that ship they should be able to take anything they met on the sea, but the captain observing an intimacy growing betwixt them and some of his men, thought it could be for no good, he therefore broke it off in time, not suffering them so much as to talk together. And when he sent a boat on shore with an officer to treat with them about the sale of slaves, the crew remained on board the boat, and no man was suffered to talk with them, but the person deputed by him for that purpose. Before he sailed away, and they found that nothing was to be done, they confessed all the designs they had formed against him. Thus he left them as he found them, in a great deal of dirty state and royalty, but with fewer subjects than they had, having, as we observed, sold many of them, and if ambition be the darling passion of men, no doubt they were happy. One of these great princes had formerly been a waterman upon the Thames, where having committed a murder, he fled to the West Indies, and was of the number of those who run away with the sloops. The rest had been all foremast men, nor was there a man amongst them, who could either read or write, and yet their secretaries of state had no more learning than themselves. This is all the account we can give of these kings of Madagascar, some of whom it is probable are reigning to this day. Chapter 2. Of Captain Martel and his crew. I come now to the pirates that have rose since the Peace of Utrecht. In wartime there is no room for any, because all those of a roving advent-rouse disposition find employment in privateers, so there is no opportunity for pirates. Like our mobs in London, when they come to any height, our superiors order out the train bands, and when once they are raised, the others are suppressed of course. I take the reason of it to be, that the mob go into the tame army, and immediately from notorious breakers of the peace, become, by being put into order, solemn preservers of it. And should our legislators put some of the pirates into authority, it would not only lessen their number, but, I imagine, set them upon the rest, and they would be the likeliest people to find them out, according to the proverb. Set a thief to catch a thief. To bring this about, there needs no other encouragement, but to give all the effects taken aboard a pirate vessel to the captors. For in case of plunder and gain, they like it as well from friends, as enemies, but are not fond, as things are carried, of ruining poor fellows, say the Creolians, with no advantage to themselves. The multitude of men and vessels, employed this way, in time of war, in the West Indies, is another reason, for the number of pirates in a time of peace. This cannot be supposed to be a reflection on any of our American governments. Much less on the king himself, by whose authority such commissions are granted, because of the reasonableness, and absolute necessity, there is for the doing of it. Yet the observation is just, for so many idle people employing themselves in privateers, for the sake of plunder and riches, which they always spend as fast as they get, that when the war is over, and they can have no farther business in the way of life they have been used to, they too readily engage in acts of piracy, which being but the same practice without a commission, they make very little distinction betwixt the lawfulness of one and the unlawfulness of the other. I have not inquired so far back, as to know the original of this rover, but I believe he and his gang, were some privateers men belonging to the island of Jamaica, in the preceding war. His story is but short, for his reign was so. An end having been put to his adventures in good time, when he was growing strong and formidable. We find him commander of a pirate sloop of 8 guns, and 80 men, in the month of September, 1716, cruising off Jamaica, Cuba, and about which time he took the Berkeley galley, Captain Saunders, and plundered him of 1,000 in money, and afterwards met with a sloop called the King Solomon, from whom he took some money, and provisions, besides goods, to a good value. They proceeded after this to the port of Cavina, at the island of Cuba, and in their way took 2 sloops, which they plundered, and let go. And off the port fell in with a fine galley, with 20 guns, called the John and Martha, Captain Wilson, which they attacked under the piratical black flag, and made themselves masters of her. They put some of the men ashore, and others they detained, as they had done several times, to increase their company. But Captain Martel charged Captain Wilson to advise his owners that their ship would answer his purpose exactly, by taking 1 deck down, and as for the cargo, which consisted chiefly of logwood and sugar, he would take care it should be carried to a good market. Having fitted up the aforesaid ship, as they designed, they mounted her with 22 guns, 100 men, and left 25 hands in the sloop, and so proceeded to cruise off the Leeward Islands, where they met with but too much success. After the taking of a sloop and a brigantine, they gave chase to a stout ship, which they came up with, and, at sight of the Pyrates' flag, she struck to the robbers, being a ship of 20 guns, called the Dolphin, bound for Newfoundland. Captain Martel made the men prisoners, and carried the ship with him. The middle of December the Pyrates took another galley in her voyage home from Jamaica, called the Kent, Captain Lawton, and shifted her provisions aboard their own ship, and let her go, which obliged her to sail back to Jamaica for a supply for her voyage. After this they met with a small ship and a sloop, belonging to Barbados. Out of both they took provisions, and then parted with them, having first taken out some of their hands, who were willing to be forced to go along with them. The Greyhound galley of London, Captain Evans, from Guinea to Jamaica, was the next that had the misfortune to fall in their way, which they did not detain long, for as soon as they could get out all her gold dust, elephants' teeth, and 40 slaves, they sent her onwards upon her voyage. They concluded now, that 'twas high time to get into harbour and refit, as well as to get refreshments themselves, and wait an opportunity to dispose of their cargo. Therefore 'twas resolved to make the best of their way to Santa Crux, a small island in the latitude of 18, 30, and 10 mile long, and 2 broad, lying southeast of Puerto Rico, belonging to the French settlements. Here they thought they might lie privately enough for some time, and fit themselves for further mischief. They met with a sloop by the way, which they took along with them, and in the beginning of the year 1716-17, they arrived at their port, having a ship of 20 guns, a sloop of 8, and 3 prizes, viz. another ship of 20 guns, a sloop of 4 guns, and another sloop last taken. With this little fleet, they got into a small harbour, or road, the N.W. part of the island, and warped up 2 creeks, which were made by a little island lying within the bay. I am the more particular now, because I shall take leave of the gentlemen, at this place. They had here bare 16-foot water, at the deepest, and but 13 or 14, at the shallowest, and nothing but rocks and sands without, which secured them from wind and sea, and likewise from any considerable force coming against them. When they had all got in, the first thing they had to do, was to guard themselves in the best manner they could. They made a battery of 4 guns upon the island, and another battery of 2 guns on the north point of the road, and warped in one of the sloops with 8 guns, at the mouth of the channel, to hinder any vessels from coming in. When this was done they went to work on their ship, unrigging, and unloading, in order to clean, where I shall leave them a while, till I bring other company to M. In the month of November, 1716, General Hamilton, Commander-in-Chief of all the Leeward Caribbee Islands, sent a sloop express to Captain Hume, at Barbados, commander of His Majesty's ship, Scarborough, of 30 guns, and 140 men, to acquaint him that 2 pirate sloops of 12 guns each, molested the colonies, having plundered several vessels. The Scarborough had buried 20 men, and had near 40 sick, and therefore was but in ill state to go to sea. However, Captain Hume left his sick men behind, and sailed to the other islands, for a supply of men, taking 20 soldiers from Antigua. At Nevis, he took 10, and 10, at St. Christopher's, and then sailed to the island of Anguilla, where he learned, that some time before, 2 such sloops had been at Spanish Town, otherwise called, one of the Virgin Islands. Accordingly, the next day, the Scarborough came to Spanish Town. But could hear no news of the sloops, only, that they had been there about Christmas, it being then the 15th of January. Captain Hume, finding no account could be had of these pirates, designed to go back, the next day, to Barbados. But, it happened, that night, that a boat anchored there from Santa Crux, and informed him, that he saw a pirate ship of 22 or 24 guns, with other vessels, going into the northwest part of the island aforesaid. The Scarborough weighed immediately, and the next morning came in sight of the rovers, and their prizes, and stood to them, but the pilot refused to venture in with the ship, all the while the pirates fired red-hot bullets from the shore. At length, the ship came to an anchor, alongside the reef, near the channel, and cannonaded for several hours, both the vessels and batteries. About 4 in the afternoon, the sloop that guarded the channel, was sunk by the shot of the man-of-war. Then she cannonaded the pirate ship of 22 guns, that lay behind the island. The next night, viz. the 18th, it falling calm, Captain Hume weighed, fearing he might fall on the reef, and so stood off and on for a day or two, to block them up. On the 20th, in the evening, they observed the man-of-war to stand off to sea, and took the opportunity to warp out, in order to slip away from the island. But at 12 o'clock they run aground, and then seeing the Scarborough about, standing in again, as their case was desperate, so they were put into the utmost confusion. They quitted their ship, and set her on fire, with 20 negroes in her, who were all burnt. 19 of the pirates made their escape in a small sloop, but the captain and the rest, with 20 negroes, betook to the woods, where 'twas probable they might starve, for we never heard what became of them afterwards. Captain Hume released the prisoners, with the ship and sloop that remained, and then went after the 2 pirate sloops first mentioned. Chapter 3 of Captain Teach, alias Blackbeard. Edward Teach was a Bristol man born, but had sailed some time out of Jamaica in privateers, in the late French War. Yet though he had often distinguished himself for his uncommon boldness and personal courage, he was never raised to any command, till he went a-pirating, which I think was at the latter end of the year 1716. When Captain Benjamin Hornigold put him into a sloop that he had made prize of, and with whom he continued in consortship till a little while before Hornigold surrendered. In the spring of the year 1717, Teach and Hornigold sailed from Providence, for the Main of America, and took in their way a billop from the Havana, with 120 barrels of flour, as also a sloop from Bermuda, Thurber master, from whom they took only some gallons of wine, and then let him go. And a ship from Madeira to South Carolina, out of which they got plunder to a considerable value. After cleaning on the coast of Virginia, they returned to the West Indies, and in the latitude of 24, made prize of a large French Guinea man, bound to Martinico, which by Hornigold's consent, Teach went aboard of as captain, and took a cruise in her. Hornigold returned with his sloop to Providence, where, at the arrival of Captain Rogers, the governor, he surrendered to mercy, pursuant to the king's proclamation. Blackbeard the pirate. Aboard of this Guinea man Teach mounted no guns, and named her the Queen Anne's Revenge, and cruising near the island of St. Vincent, took a large ship, called the Great Allen, Christopher Taylor commander. The pirates plundered her of what they thought fit, put all the men ashore upon the island above mentioned, and then set fire to the ship. A few days after, Teach fell in with the Scarborough man-of-war, of 30 guns, who engaged him for some hours. But she finding the pirate well manned, and having tried her strength, gave over the engagement, and returned to Barbados, the place of her station, and Teach sailed towards the Spanish America. In his way he met with a pirate sloop of 10 guns, commanded by one Major Bonnet, lately a gentleman of good reputation and estate in the island of Barbados, whom he joined. But in a few days after, Teach, finding that Bonnet knew nothing of a maritime life, with the consent of his own men, put in another captain, one Richards, to command Bonnet's sloop, and took the Major on aboard his own ship, telling him that as he had not been used to the fatigues and care of such a post, it would be better for him to decline it, and live easy and at his pleasure, in such a ship as his, where he should not be obliged to perform duty, but follow his own inclinations. At Turnif 10 leagues short of the Bay of Honduras, the pirates took in fresh water. And while they were at an anchor there, they saw a sloop coming in, whereupon, Richards in the sloop called the Revenge, slipped his cable, and run out to meet her. Who upon seeing the black flag hoisted, struck his sail and came to, under the stern of Teach the Commodore. She was called the Adventure, from Jamaica, David Harriet master. They took him and his men aboard the great ship, and sent a number of other hands with Israel Hands, master of Teach's ship, to man the sloop for the piratical account. The 9th of April, they weighed from Turnif, having lain there about a week, and sailed to the bay, where they found a ship and 4 sloops, 3 of the latter belonged to Jonathan Bernard, of Jamaica, and the other to Captain James. The ship was of Boston, called the Protestant Caesar, Captain Wire commander. Teach hoisted his black colors, and fired a gun, upon which Captain Wire and all his men, left their ship, and got ashore in their boat. Teach's quartermaster, and 8 of his crew, took possession of Wire's ship, and Richards secured all the sloops, one of which they burnt out of spite to the owner. The Protestant Caesar they also burnt, after they had plundered her, because she belonged to Boston, where some men had been hanged for piracy, and the 3 sloops belonging to Bernard they let go. From hence the rovers sailed to Turkille, and then to the Grand Caymans, a small island about 30 leagues to the westward of Jamaica, where they took a small turtler, and so to the Havana, and from thence to the Bahama wrecks. And from the Bahama wrecks, they sailed to Carolina, taking a brigantine and 2 sloops in their way, where they lay off the bar of Charlestown for 5 or 6 days. They took here a ship as she was coming out, bound for London, commanded by Robert Clark, with some passengers on board for England. The next day they took another vessel coming out of Charlestown, and also 2 pinks coming into Charlestown. Likewise a brigantine with 14 negroes aboard. All which being done in the face of the town, struck a great terror to the whole province of Carolina, having just before been visited by Vane, another notorious pirate, that they abandoned themselves to despair, being in no condition to resist their force. They were 8 sail in the harbor, ready for the sea, but none dared to venture out, it being almost impossible to escape their hands. The inward-bound vessels were under the same unhappy dilemma, so that the trade of this place was totally interrupted. What made these misfortunes heavier to them, was a long expensive war, the colony had had with the natives, which was but just ended when these robbers infested them. Teach detained all the ships and prisoners, and, being in want of medicines, resolves to demand a chest from the government of the province. Accordingly Richards, the captain of the Revenge sloop, with 2 or 3 more pirates, were sent up along with Mr. Marks, one of the prisoners, whom they had taken in Clark's ship, and very insolently made their demands, threatening, that if they did not send immediately the chest of medicines, and let the pirate ambassadors return, without offering any violence to their persons, they would murder all their prisoners, send up their heads to the governor, and set the ships they had taken on fire. Whilst Mr. Marks was making application to the council, Richards, and the rest of the pirates, walked the streets publicly, in the sight of all people, who were fired with the utmost indignation, looking upon them as robbers and murderers, and particularly the authors of their wrongs and oppressions, but durst not so much as think of executing their revenge, for fear of bringing more calamities upon themselves, and so they were forced to let the villains pass with impunity. The government were not long in deliberating upon the message, though 'twas the greatest affront that could have been put upon them, yet for the saving so many men's lives, among them, Mr. Samuel Ragg, one of the council Winky-face, they complied with the necessity, and sent aboard a chest, valued at between 300 and 400 L, and the pirates went back safe to their ships. Blackbeard, for so Teach was generally called, as we shall hereafter shew, as soon as he had received the medicines and his brother rogues, let go the ships and the prisoners, having first taken out of them in gold and silver, about 1500 L. sterling, besides provisions and other matters. From the bar of Charlestown, they sailed to North Carolina. Captain Teach in the ship, which they called the man of war, Captain Richards and Captain Hands in the sloops, which they termed privateers, and another sloop serving them as a tender. Teach began now to think of breaking up the company, and securing the money and the best of the effects for himself, and some others of his companions he had most friendship for, and to cheat the rest, accordingly. On pretence of running into Topsail Inlet to clean, he grounded his ship, and then, as if it had been done undesignedly, and by accident, he orders Hans's sloop to come to his assistance, and get him off again, which he endeavoring to do, ran the sloop on shore near the other, and so were both lost. This done, Teach goes into the tender sloop, with 40 hands, and leaves the Revenge there. Then takes 17 others and maroons them upon a small sandy island, about a league from the main, where there was neither bird, beast or herb for their subsistence, and where they must have perished if Major Bonnet had not 2 days after taken them off. Teach goes up to the governor of North Carolina, with about 20 of his men, surrender to his Majesty's proclamation, and receive certificates thereof, from his Excellency. But it did not appear that their submitting to this pardon was from any reformation of manners, but only to wait a more favourable opportunity to play the same game over again, which he soon after effected, with greater security to himself, and with much better prospect of success, having in this time cultivated a very good understanding with Charles Eden, Esq., the governor above mentioned. The first piece of service this kind governor did to Blackbeard, was, to give him a right to the vessel which he had taken, when he was a pirating in the great ship called the Queen Anne's Revenge. For which purpose, a court of vice-admiralty was held at Bathtown, and, though Teach had never any commission in his life, and the sloop belonging to the English merchants, and taken in time of peace, yet was she condemned as a prize taken from the Spaniards, by the said Teach. These proceedings shew that governors are but men. Before he sailed upon his adventures, he married a young creature of about 16 years of age, the governor performing the ceremony. As it is accustomed to marry here by a priest, so it is there by a magistrate. And this, I have been informed, made Teach's 14th wife, whereof, about a dozen might be still living. His behavior in this state, was something extraordinary. For, while his sloop lay in Ocracoke Inlet, and he ashore at a plantation, where his wife lived, with whom after he had lain all night, it was his custom to invite 5 or 6 of his brutal companions to come ashore. And he would force her to prostitute herself to them all, one after another, before his face. In June 1718, he went to sea, upon another expedition, and steered his course towards Bermudas. He met with 2 or 3 English vessels in his way, but robbed them only of provisions, stores and other necessaries, for his present expense. But near the island aforementioned, he fell in with 2 French ships, one of them was loaden with sugar and cocoa, and the other light, both bound to Martinico. The ship that had no lading he let go, and putting all the men of the loaded ship aboard her, he brought home the other with her cargo to North Carolina, where the governor and the pirates shared the plunder. When Teach and his prize arrived, he and 4 of his crew went to his Excellency, and made affidavit, that they found the French ship at sea, without a soul on board her. And then a court was called, and the ship condemned. The governor had 60 hogsheads of sugar for his dividend, and one Mr. Knight, who was his secretary, and collector for the province, 20, and the rest was shared among the other pirates. The business was not yet done, the ship remained, and it was possible one or other might come into the river, that might be acquainted with her, and so discover the roguery. But Teach thought of a contrivance to prevent this, for, upon a pretence that she was leaky, and that she might sink, and so stop up the mouth of the inlet or cove where she lay, he obtained an order from the governor to bring her out into the river, and set her on fire, which was accordingly executed, and she was burnt down to the water's edge, her bottom sunk, and with it, their fears of her ever rising in judgment against them. Captain Teach, alias Blackbeard, passed 3 or 4 months in the river, sometimes lying at anchor in the coves, at other times sailing from one inlet to another, trading with such sloops as he met, for the plunder he had taken, and would often give them presents for stores and provisions took from them. That is, when he happened to be in a giving humor. At other times he made bold with them, and took what he liked, without saying, by your leave, knowing well, they dared not send him a bill for the payment. He often diverted himself with going ashore among the planters, where he revelled night and day. By these he was well received, but whether out of love or fear, I cannot say. Sometimes he used them courteously enough, and made them presents of rum and sugar, in recompense of what he took from them. But, as for liberties, which, 'tis said, he and his companions often took with the wives and daughters of the planters, I cannot take upon me to say, whether he paid them ad valorem or no. At other times he carried it in a lordly manner towards them, and would lay some of them under contribution. Nay, he often proceeded to bully the governor, not, that I can discover the least cause of quarrel betwixt them, but it seemed only to be done, to shew he dared do it. The sloops trading up and down this river, being so frequently pillaged by Blackbeard, consulted with the traders, and some of the best of the planters, what course to take. They saw plainly it would be in vain to make any application to the governor of North Carolina, to whom it properly belonged to find some redress. So that if they could not be relieved from some other quarter, Blackbeard would be like to reign with impunity. Therefore, with as much secrecy as possible, they sent a deputation to Virginia, to lay the affair before the governor of that colony, and to solicit an armed force from the men of war lying there, to take or destroy this pirate. This governor consulted with the captains of the 2 men of war, viz. the Pearl and Lime, who had lain in St. James's River, about 10 months. It was agreed that the governor should hire a couple of small sloops, and the men of war should man them. This was accordingly done, and the command of them given to Mr. Robert Maynard, first lieutenant of the Pearl, an experienced officer, and a gentleman of great bravery and resolution, as will appear by his gallant behavior in this expedition. The sloops were well manned and furnished with ammunition and small arms, but had no guns mounted. About the time of their going out, the governor called an assembly, in which it was resolved to publish a proclamation, offering certain rewards to any person or persons, who, within a year after that time, should take or destroy any pirate. The original proclamation being in our hands, is as follows. By His Majesty's Lieutenant Governor, and Commander-in-Chief, of the Colony in Dominion of Virginia. A proclamation publishing the rewards given for apprehending, or killing, pirates. Whereas, by an Act of Assembly, made at a session of Assembly, begun at the Capitol in Williamsburg, the 11th day of November, in the 5th year of His Majesty's reign, intituled An Act to encourage the apprehending and destroying of pirates, it is, amongst other things enacted, that all and every person, or persons, from and after the 14th day of November, in the year of our Lord 1718, and before the 14th day of November, which shall be in the year of our Lord 1719, shall take any pirate, or pirates, on the sea or land, or in case of resistance, shall kill any such pirate, or pirates, between the degrees of 34, and 39, of northern latitude, and within 100 leagues of the continent of Virginia, or within the provinces of Virginia, or North Carolina, upon the conviction, or making due proof of the killing of all, and every such pirate, and pirates, before the governor and council, shall be entitled to have, and receive out of the public money, in the hands of the treasurer of this colony, the several rewards following. That is to say, for Edward Teach, commonly called Captain Teach, or Blackbeard, £100, for every other commander of a pirate ship, sloop, or vessel, £40. For every lieutenant, master, or quartermaster, boatswain, or carpenter, £20, for every other inferior officer, £16, and for every private man taken on board such ship, sloop, or vessel, £10. And, that for every pirate, which shall be taken by any ship, sloop or vessel, belonging to this colony, or North Carolina, within the time aforesaid, in any place whatsoever, the like rewards shall be paid according to the quality and condition of such pirates. Wherefore, for the encouragement of all such persons as shall be willing to serve His Majesty, and their country, in so just and honorable an undertaking, as the suppressing a sort of people, who may be truly called enemies to mankind, I have thought fit, with the advice and consent of His Majesty's Council, to issue this proclamation, hereby declaring, the said rewards shall be punctually and justly paid, in current money of Virginia, according to the directions of the said Act. And, I do order and appoint this proclamation, to be published by the sheriffs, at their respective county houses, and by all ministers and readers, in the several churches and chapels, throughout this colony. Given at our council chamber at Williamsburg. This 24th day of November, 1718. In the 5th year of His Majesty's reign. God save the King. A. Spotswood. The 17th of November, 1718, the lieutenant sailed from Kicqueton, in James River in Virginia, and, the 21st in the evening, came to the mouth of Ocracoke Inlet, where he got sight of the pirate. This expedition was made with all imaginable secrecy, and the officer managed with all the prudence that was necessary, stopping all boats and vessels he met with, in the river, from going up, and thereby preventing any intelligence from reaching Blackbeard, and receiving at the same time an account from them all, of the place where the pirate was lurking. But notwithstanding this caution, Blackbeard had information of the design, from His Excellency of the province, and his secretary, Mr. Knight, wrote him a letter, particularly concerning it, intimating, that he had sent him 4 of his men, which were all he could meet with, in or about town, and so bid him be upon his guard. These men belonged to Blackbeard, and were sent from Bath Town to Ocracoke Inlet, where the sloop lay, which is about 20 leagues. Blackbeard had heard several reports, which happened not to be true, and so gave the less credit to this, nor was he convinced till he saw the sloops, whereupon he put his vessel in a posture of defense. He had no more than 25 men on board, though he gave out to all the vessels he spoke with, that he had 40. When he had prepared for battle, he sat down and spent the night in drinking with the master of a trading sloop, who, 'twas thought, had more business with Teach, than he should have had. Lieutenant Maynard came to an anchor, for the place being shoal, and the channel intricate, there was no getting in, where Teach lay, that night, but in the morning he weighed, and sent his boat ahead of the sloops to sound. And coming within gunshot of the pirate, received his fire, whereupon Maynard hoisted the king's colours, and stood directly towards him, with the best way that his sails and oars could made. Blackbeard cut his cable, and endeavoured to make a running fight, keeping a continual fire at his enemies, with his guns. Mr. Maynard not having any, kept a constant fire with small arms, while some of his men laboured at their oars. In a little time Teach's sloop ran aground, and Mr. Maynard's drawing more water than that of the pirate, he could not come near him. So he anchored within half gunshot of the enemy, and, in order to lighten his vessel, that he might run him aboard, the lieutenant ordered all his ballast to be thrown overboard, and all the water to be staved, and then wait and stood for him. Upon which Blackbeard hailed him in this rude manner, "Damn you for villains, who are you? And, from whence came you?" The lieutenant made him answer, "You may see by our colours we are no pirates." Blackbeard bid him send his boat on board, that he might see who he was, but Mr. Maynard replied thus, "I cannot spare my boat, but I will come aboard of you as soon as I can, with my sloop." Upon this, Blackbeard took a glass of liquor, and drank to him with these words, "Damnation seize my soul if I give you quarters, or take any from you." In answer to which, Mr. Maynard told him, that he expected no quarters from him, nor should he give him any. By this time Blackbeard's sloop fleeted, as Mr. Maynard's sloops were rowing towards him, which being not above a foot high in the waist, and consequently the men all exposed, as they came near together, there being hitherto little or no execution done, on either side. The pirate fired a broadside, charged with all manner of small shot. A fatal stroke to them. The sloop the lieutenant was in, having 20 men killed and wounded, and the other sloop 9. This could not be helped, for there being no wind, they were obliged to keep to their oars, otherwise the pirate would have got away from him, which, it seems, the lieutenant was resolute to prevent. After this unlucky blow, Blackbeard's sloop fell broadside to the shore. Mr. Maynard's other sloop, which was called the Ranger, fell astern, being, for the present, disabled. So the lieutenant finding his own sloop had way, and would soon be on board of Teach, he ordered all his men down, for fear of another broadside, which must have been their destruction, and the loss of their expedition. Mr. Maynard was the only person that kept the deck, except the man at the helm, whom he directed to lie down snug, and the men in the hold were ordered to get their pistols and their swords ready for close fighting, and to come up at his command. In order to which, 2 ladders were placed in the hatchway for the more expedition. When the lieutenant's sloop boarded the other, Captain Teach's men threw in several new-fashioned sort of grenados, viz. Case bottles filled with powder, and small shot, slugs, and pieces of lead or iron, with a quick match in the mouth of it, which being lighted without side, presently runs into the bottle to the powder, and as it is instantly thrown on board, generally does great execution, besides putting all the crew into a confusion. But by good providence, they had not that effect here, the men being in the hold, and Blackbeard seeing few or no hands aboard, told his men, that they were all knocked on the head, except 3 or 4. And therefore, says he, let's jump on board, and cut them to pieces. Whereupon, under the smoke of one of the bottles just mentioned, Blackbeard enters with 14 men, over the bows of Maynard's sloop, and were not seen by him till the air cleared. However, he just then gave a signal to his men, who all rose in an instant, and attacked the pirates with as much bravery as ever was done upon such an occasion. Blackbeard and the lieutenant fired the first pistol at each other, by which the pirate received a wound, and then engaged with swords, till the lieutenant's unluckily broke, and stepping back to cock a pistol, Blackbeard, with his cutlash, was striking at that instant. That one of Maynard's men gave him a terrible wound in the neck and throat, by which the lieutenant came off with a small cut over his fingers. They were now closely and warmly engaged, the lieutenant and 12 men, against Blackbeard and 14, till the sea was tinctured with blood round the vessel. Blackbeard received a shot into his body from the pistol that Lieutenant Maynard discharged, yet he stood his ground, and fought with great fury, till he received 25 wounds, and 5 of them by shot. At length, as he was cocking another pistol, having fired several before, he fell down dead. By which time 8 more out of the 14 dropped, and all the rest, much wounded, jumped overboard, and called out for quarters, which was granted, though it was only prolonging their lives for a few days. The sloop Ranger came up, and attacked the men that remained in Blackbeard's sloop, with equal bravery, till they likewise cried for quarters. Here was an end of that courageous brute, who might have passed in the world for a hero, had he been employed in a good cause. His destruction, which was of such consequence to the plantations, was entirely owing to the conduct and bravery of Lieutenant Maynard and his men, who might have destroyed him with much less loss, had they had a vessel with great guns. But they were obliged to use small vessels, because the holes and places he lurked in, would not admit of others of greater draught. And it was no small difficulty for this gentleman to get to him, having grounded his vessel, at least, 100 times, in getting up the river, besides other discouragements, enough to have turned back any gentleman without dishonor. Who was less resolute and bold than this lieutenant? The broadside that did so much mischief before they boarded, in all probability saved the rest from destruction. For before that Teach had little or no hopes of escaping, and therefore had posted a resolute fellow, a negro whom he had bred up, with a lighted match, in the powder room, with commands to blow up when he should give him orders. Which was as soon as the lieutenant and his men could have entered, that so he might have destroyed his conquerors, and when the negro found how it went with Blackbeard, he could hardly be persuaded from the rash action. By 2 prisoners that were then in the hold of the sloop. What seems a little odd, is, that some of these men, who behaved so bravely against Blackbeard, went afterwards a-pirating themselves, and one of them was taken along with Roberts. But I do not find that any of them were provided for, except one that was hanged, but this is a digression. The lieutenant caused Blackbeard's head to be severed from his body, and hung up at the boltsprit end, then he sailed to Bathtown, to get relief for his wounded men. It must be observed, that in rummaging the pirate sloop, they found several letters and written papers, which discovered the correspondence betwixt Governor Eden, the secretary and collector, and also some traders at New York, and Blackbeard. It is likely he had regard enough for his friends, to have destroyed these papers before the action, in order to hinder them from falling into such hands, where the discovery would be of no use, either to the interest or reputation of these fine gentlemen, if it had not been his fixed resolution to have blown up together, when he found no possibility of escaping. When the lieutenant came to Bath Town, he made bold to seize in the governor's storehouse, the 60 hogsheads of sugar, and from honest Mr. Knight, 20, which it seems was their dividend of the plunder taken in the French ship. The latter did not long survive this shameful discovery, for being apprehensive that he might be called to an account for these trifles, fell sick with the fright and died in a few days. After the wounded men were pretty well recovered, the lieutenant sailed back to the men of war in James River, in Virginia, with Blackbeard's head still hanging at the boltsprit end, and 15 prisoners, 13 of whom were hanged. It appearing upon trial, that one of them, viz. Samuel Odell, was taken out of the trading sloop, but the night before the engagement. This poor fellow was a little unlucky at his first entering upon his new trade, there appearing no less than 70 wounds upon him after the action, notwithstanding which, he lived, and was cured of them all. The other person that escaped the gallows, was one Israel Hands, the master of Blackbeard's sloop, and formerly captain of the same, before the Queen Anne's Revenge was lost in Topsail Inlet. The aforesaid Hands happened not to be in the fight, but was taken afterwards ashore at Bath Town, having been some time before disabled by Blackbeard, in one of his savage humours, after the following manner. One night drinking in his cabin with Hands, the pilot, and another man. Blackbeard without any provocation privately draws out a small pair of pistols, and cocks them under the table, which being perceived by the man, he withdrew and went upon deck, leaving Hands, the pilot, and the captain together. When the pistols were ready, he blew out the candle, and crossing his hands, discharged them at his company. Hands, the master, was shot through the knee, and lammed for life. The other pistol did no execution. Being asked the meaning of this, he only answered, by damning them, that if he did not now and then kill one of them, they would forget who he was. Hands being taken, was tried and condemned, but just as he was about to be executed, a ship arrives at Virginia with a proclamation for prolonging the time of His Majesty's pardon. To such of the pirates as should surrender by a limited time therein expressed, notwithstanding the sentence, Hands pleaded the pardon, and was allowed the benefit of it, and is alive at this time in London, begging his bread. Now that we have given some account of Teach's life and actions, it will not be amiss, that we speak of his beard, since it did not a little contribute towards making his name so terrible in those parts. Plutarch and other grave historians have taken notice, that several great men amongst the Romans, took their surnames from certain odd marks in their countenances, as Cicero, from a mark or vetch on his nose. So our hero, Captain Teach, assumed the cognomen of Blackbeard, from that large quantity of hair, which, like a frightful meteor, covered his whole face, and frightened America more than any comet that has appeared there a long time. This beard was black, which he suffered to grow of an extravagant length, as to breadth, it came up to his eyes. He was accustomed to twist it with ribbons, in small tails, after the manner of our Ramley's wigs, and turn them about his ears. In time of action, he wore a sling over his shoulders, with 3 brace of pistols, hanging in holsters like bandoliers, and stuck lighted matches under his hat, which appearing on each side of his face, his eyes naturally looking fierce and wild, made him altogether such a figure, that imagination cannot form an idea of a fury, from hell, to look more frightful. If he had the look of a fury, his humours and passions were suitable to it. We shall relate 2 or 3 more of his extravagancies, which we omitted in the body of his history, by which it will appear, to what a pitch of wickedness, human nature may arrive, if its passions are not checked. In the commonwealth of pirates, he who goes the greatest length of wickedness, is looked upon with a kind of envy amongst them, as a person of a more extraordinary gallantry, and is thereby entitled to be distinguished by some post. And if such a one has but courage, he must certainly be a great man. The hero of whom we are writing, was thoroughly accomplished this way, and some of his frolics of wickedness, were so extravagant, as if he aimed at making his men believe he was a devil incarnate. For being one day at sea, and a little flushed with drink, "Come," says he, "let us make a hell of our own, and try how long we can bear it." Accordingly he, with 2 or 3 others, went down into the hold, and closing up all the hatches, filled several pots full of brimstone, and other combustible matter, and set it on fire, and so continued till they were almost suffocated. when some of the men cried out for air. At length he opened the hatches, not a little pleased that he held out the longest. The night before he was killed, he sat up and drank till the morning, with some of his own men, and the master of a merchantman, and having had intelligence of the 2 sloops coming to attack him, as has been before observed. One of his men asked him, in case anything should happen to him in the engagement with the sloops, whether his wife knew where he had buried his money? He answered, that nobody but himself and the devil knew where it was, and the longest liver should take all. Those of his crew who were taken alive, told a story which may appear a little incredible. However, we think it will not be fair to omit it, since we had it from their own mouths. That once upon a cruise, they found out that they had a man on board more than their crew. Such a one was seen several days amongst them, sometimes below, and sometimes upon deck, yet no man in the ship could give an account who he was, or from whence he came. But that he disappeared little before they were cast away in their great ship, but, it seems, they verily believed it was the devil. One would think these things should induce them to reform their lives, but so many reprobates together, encouraged and spirited one another up in their wickedness, to which a continual course of drinking did not a little contribute. For in Blackbeard's journal, which was taken, there were several memorandums of the following nature, sound writ with his own hand. Such a day, rum all out, our company somewhat sober, a damned confusion amongst us, rogues applauding. Great talk of separation. So I looked sharp for a prize, such a day took one, with a great deal of liquor on board, so kept the company hot, damned hot, then all things went well again. Thus it was these wretches passed their lives, with very little pleasure or satisfaction, in the possession of what they violently take away from others, and sure to pay for it at last, by an ignominious death. The names of the pirates killed in the engagement, are as follow. Edward Teach, Commander. Philip Morton, Gunner. Garat Gibbons, Boatswain. Owen Roberts, Carpenter. Thomas Miller, Quartermaster. John Husk. Joseph Curtis. Joseph Brooks, 1. Nath. Jackson. All the rest, except the 2 last, were wounded and afterwards hanged in Virginia. John Carnes, Joseph Phillips. Joseph Brooks, 2, James Robbins. James Blake, John Martin. John Gills, Edward Salter. Thomas Gates, Stephen Daniel. James White, Richard Greensail. Richard Stiles, Israel Hands, pardoned. Caesar, Samuel Odell, acquitted. There were in the pirate sloops, and ashore in a tent, near where the sloops lay, 25 hogsheads of sugar, 11 tierces, and 145 bags of cocoa, a barrel of indigo, and a bale of cotton. Which, with what was taken from the governor and secretary, and the sale of the sloop, came to 2,500 L besides the rewards paid by the governor of Virginia, pursuant to his proclamation. All which was divided among the companies of the 2 ships, Lime and Pearl, that lay in James River, the brave fellows that took them coming in for no more than their dividend amongst the rest, and was paid it within these 3 months. Chapter 4. Of Major Stede Bonnet and his crew. The Major was a gentleman of good reputation in the island of Barbados, was master of a plentiful fortune, and had the advantage of a liberal education. He had the least temptation of any man to follow such a course of life, from the condition of his circumstances. It was very surprising to every one, to hear of the Major's enterprise, in the island where he lived. And as he was generally esteemed and honored, before he broke out into open acts of piracy, so he was afterwards rather pitied than condemned, by those that were acquainted with him, believing that this humor of going a-pirating proceeded from a disorder in his mind, which had been but too visible in him, some time before this wicked undertaking. And which is said to have been occasioned by some discomforts he found in a married state. Be that as it will, the Major was but ill qualified for the business, as not understanding maritime affairs. However, he fitted out a sloop with 10 guns and 70 men, entirely at his own expense, and in the night time sailed from Barbados. He called his sloop the Revenge. His first cruise was off the Capes of Virginia, where he took several ships, and plundered them of their provisions, clothes, money, ammunition, and in particular the Anne, Captain Montgomery, from Glasgow. The turbot from Barbados, which for country's sake, after they had taken out the principal part of the lading, the pirate crew set her on fire, the Endeavour, Captain Scott, from Bristol, and the Young from Leith. From hence they went to New York, and off the east end of Long Island, took a sloop bound for the West Indies, after which they stood in and landed some men at Gardiner's Island, but in a peaceable manner, and bought provisions for the company's use, which they paid for, and so went off again without molestation. Some time after, which was in August 1717, Bonnet came off the bar of South Carolina, and took a sloop and a brigantine bound in. The sloop belonged to Barbados, Joseph Palmer master, laden with rum, sugar and negroes. And the brigantine came from New England, Thomas Porter master, whom they plundered, and then dismissed, but they sailed away with the sloop, and at an inlet in North Carolina careened by her, and then set her on fire. After the sloop had cleaned, they put to sea, but came to no resolution what course to take. The crew were divided in their opinions, some being for one thing, and some another, so that nothing but confusion seemed to attend all their schemes. The Major was no sailor as was said before, and therefore had been obliged to yield to many things that were imposed on him, during their undertaking, for want of a competent knowledge in maritime affairs. At length happening to fall in company with another pirate, one Edward Teach, who for his remarkable black ugly beard, was more commonly called Blackbeard. This fellow was a good sailor, but a most cruel hardened villain. Bold and daring to the last degree, and would not stick at the perpetrating the most abominable wickedness imaginable. For which he was made chief of that execrable gang, that it might be said that his post was not unduly filled, Blackbeard being truly the superior in roguery, of all the company, as has been already related. To him Bonnet's crew joined in consortship, and Bonnet himself was laid aside, notwithstanding the sloop was his own. He went aboard Blackbeard's ship, not concerning himself with any of their affairs, where he continued till she was lost in Topsail Inlet, and one Richards was appointed captain in his room. The Major now saw his folly, but could not help himself, which made him melancholy. He reflected upon his past course of life, and was confounded with shame. When he thought upon what he had done, his behavior was taken notice of by the other pirates, who liked him never the better for it. And he often declared to some of them, that he would gladly leave off that way of living, being fully tired of it, but he should be ashamed to see the face of any English man again. Therefore if he could get to Spain or Portugal, where he might be undiscovered, he would spend the remainder of his days in either of those countries, otherwise he must continue with them as long as he lived. When Blackbeard lost his ship at Topsail Inlet, and surrendered to the King's proclamation, Bonnet reassumed the command of his own sloop, Revenge, goes directly away to Bathtown in North Carolina, surrenders likewise to the King's pardon, and receives a certificate. The war was now broke out between the Triple Allies and Spain, so Major Bonnet gets a clearance for his sloop at North Carolina, to go to the island of St. Thomas, with a design, at least it was pretended so, to get the Emperor's commission, to go a privateering upon the Spaniards. When Bonnet came back to Topsail Inlet, he found that Teach and his gang were gone, and that they had taken all the money, small arms and effects of value out of the great ship, and set ashore on a small sandy island above a league from the main. 17 men, no doubt with a design they should perish, there being no inhabitant, or provisions to subsist withal, nor any boat or materials to build or make any kind of launch or vessel. To escape from that desolate place, they remained there 2 nights and 1 day, without subsistence, or the least prospect of any, expecting nothing else but a lingering death. When to their inexpressible comfort, they saw redemption at hand. For Major Bonnet happening to get intelligence of their being there, by 2 of the pirates who had escaped Teach's cruelty, and had got to a poor little village at the upper end of the harbor, sent his boat to make discovery of the truth of the matter, which the poor wretches seeing, made a signal to them, and they were all brought on board Bonnet's sloop. Major Bonnet told all his company, that he would take a commission to go against the Spaniards, and to that end, was going to St. Thomas's. Therefore if they would go with him, they should be welcome. Whereupon they all consented, but as the sloop was preparing to sail, a bomb boat, that brought apples and cider to sell to the sloop's men, informed them, that Captain Teach lay at Ocracoke Inlet, with only 18 or 20 hands. Bonnet, who bore him a mortal hatred for some insults offered him, went immediately in pursuit of Blackbeard, but it happened too late, for he missed of him there, and after 4 days' cruise, hearing no farther news of him, they steered their course towards Virginia. In the month of July, these adventurers came off the Capes, and meeting with a Pink with a stock of provisions on board, which they happened to be in want of, they took out of her 10 or 12 barrels of pork, and about 400 weight of bread. But because they would not have this set down to the account of piracy, they gave them 8 or 10 casks of rice, and an old cable, in lieu thereof. 2 days afterwards they chased a sloop of 60 ton, and took her 2 leagues off of Cape Henry. They were so happy here as to get a supply of liquor to their victuals, for they brought from her 2 hogsheads of rum, and as many of molasses, which, it seems, they had need of. Though they had not ready money to purchase them, what security they intended to give, I can't tell, but Bonnet sent 8 men to take care of the prize sloop, who, perhaps, not caring to make use of those accustomed freedoms, took the first opportunity to go off with her, and Bonnet, who was pleased to have himself called Captain Thomas, saw them no more. After this, the Major threw off all restraint, and though he had just before received His Majesty's mercy, in the name of Stede Bonnet, he relapsed in good earnest into his old vocation, by the name of Captain Thomas, and recommenced a downright pirate, by taking and plundering all the vessels he met with. He took off Cape Henry 2 ships from Virginia, bound to Glasgow, out of which they had very little besides 100 weight of tobacco. The next day they took a small sloop bound from Virginia to Bermudas, which supplied them with 20 barrels of pork, some bacon, and they gave her in return 2 barrels of rice, and a hogshead of molasses. Out of this sloop 2 men entered voluntarily. The next they took was another Virginia man, bound to Glasgow, out of which they had nothing of value, save only a few combs, pins and needles, and gave her instead thereof, a barrel of pork, and 2 barrels of bread. From Virginia they sailed to Philadelphia, and in the latitude of 38 north, they took a schooner, coming from North Carolina, bound to Boston. They had out of her only 2 dozen of calfskins, to make covers for guns, and 2 of their hands, and detained her some days. All this was but small game, and seemed as if they designed only to make provision for their sloop against they arrived at St. Thomas's, for they hitherto had dealt favourably with all that were so unhappy as so fall into their hands. But those that came after, fared not so well, for in the latitude of 32, off of Delaware River, near Philadelphia, they took 2 snows bound to Bristol, out of whom they got some money, besides goods, perhaps to the value of 150 pounds. At the same time they took a sloop of 60 tons bound from Philadelphia to Barbados, which after taking some goods out, they dismissed along with the snows. The 29th day of July, Captain Thomas took a sloop of 50 tons, 6 or 7 leagues off Delaware Bay, bound from Philadelphia to Barbados, Thomas Red Master, loaden with provisions, which they kept, and put 4 or 5 of their hands on board her. The last day of July, they took another sloop of 60 tons, commanded by Peter Manwaring, bound from Antigua to Philadelphia, which they likewise kept with all the cargo, consisting chiefly of rum, molasses, sugar, cotton, indigo, and about 25 pound in money, valued in all to 500 pound. The last day of July, our rovers with the vessels last taken, left Delaware Bay, and sailed to Cape Fear River, where they stayed too long for their safety, for the pirate sloop which they now knew named the Royal James, proved very leaky. So that they were obliged to remain here almost 2 months, to refit and repair their vessel. They took in this river a small shallop, which they ripped up to mend the sloop, and retarded the further prosecution of their voyage, as before mentioned, till the news came to Carolina, of a pirate sloop's being there to careen with her prizes. Upon this information, the Council of South Carolina was alarmed, and apprehended they should receive another visit from them speedily. To prevent which, Colonel William Rhett, of the same province, waited on the governor, and generously offered himself to go with 2 sloops to attack this pirate, which the governor readily accepted, and accordingly gave the colonel a commission and full power, to fit such vessels as he thought proper for the design. In a few days 2 sloops were equipped and manned, the Henry with 8 guns and 70 men, commanded by Captain John Masters, and the Sea Nymph, with 8 guns and 60 men, commanded by Captain Phayer Hull. Both under the entire direction and command of the aforesaid Colonel Rhett, who, on the 14th of September, went on board the Henry, and, with the other sloop, sailed from Charlestown to Swillivant's Island, to put themselves in order for the cruise. Just then arrived a small ship from Antigua, 1 cock master, with an account, that in sight of the bar he was taken and plundered by one Charles Vane, a pirate, in a brigantine of 12 guns and 90 men. And who had also taken 2 other vessels bound in there, one a small sloop, Captain Dilmaster, from Barbados. The other a brigantine, Captain Thompson Master, from Guinea, with 90-odd negroes, which they took out of the vessel, and put on board another sloop then under the command of one Yates, his consort, with 25 men. This proved fortunate to the owners of the Guinea man, for Yates having often attempted to quit this course of life, took an opportunity in the night, to leave Vane and to run into North Edisto River, to the southward of Charlestown. And surrendered to His Majesty's pardon. The owners got their negroes, and Yates and his men had certificates given them from the government. Vane cruised some time off the bar, in hopes to catch Yates, and unfortunately for them, took 2 ships coming out, bound to London, and while the prisoners were aboard, some of the pirates gave out that they designed to go into one of the rivers to the southward. Colonel Rhett, upon hearing this, sailed over the bar the 15th of September, with the 2 sloops before mentioned, and having the wind northerly, went after the pirate Vane, and scoured the rivers and inlets to the southward. But not meeting with him, tacked and stood for Cape Fear River, in prosecution of his first design. On the 26th following, in the evening, the colonel with his small squadron, entered the river, and saw, over a point of land, 3 sloops at an anchor, which were Major Bonnet and his prizes. But it happened that in going up the river, the pilot run the colonel's sloops aground, and it was dark before they were on float, which hindered their getting up that night. The pirates soon discovered the sloops, but not knowing who they were, or upon what design they came into that river, they manned 3 canoes, and sent them down to take them, but they quickly found their mistake, and returned to the sloop with the unwelcome news. Major Bonnet made preparations that night for engaging, and took all the men out of the prizes. He shewed Captain Manwaring, one of his prisoners, a letter he had just wrote, which he declared he would send to the governor of Carolina. The letter was to this effect, viz. that if the sloops, which then appeared, were sent out against him, by the said governor, and he should get clear off, that he would burn and destroy all ships or vessels going in or coming out of South Carolina. The next morning they got under sail, and came down the river, designing only a running fight. Colonel Rhett's sloops got likewise under sail, and stood for him, getting upon each quarter of the pirate, with intent to board him. Which he perceiving, edged in towards the shore, and being warmly engaged, their sloop ran aground, the Carolina sloops being in the same shoal water, were in the same circumstances. The Henry, in which Colonel Rhett was, grounded within pistol shot of the pirate, and on his bow, the other sloop grounded right ahead of him, and almost out of gunshot, which made her of little service to the colonel, while they lay aground. At this time the pirate had a considerable advantage, for their sloop, after she was aground, listed from Colonel Rhett's, by which means they were all covered, and the colonel's sloop listing the same way, his men were much exposed. Notwithstanding which, they kept a brisk fire the whole time they lay thus aground, which was near 5 hours. The pirates made a with in their bloody flag, and beckoned several times with their hats in derision to the colonel's men, to come on board, which they answered with cheerful huzzas, and said, that they would speak with them by and by. Which accordingly happened, for the colonel's sloop being first afloat, he got into deeper water, and after mending the sloop's rigging, which was much shattered in the engagement, they stood for the pirate, to give the finishing stroke. And designed to go directly on board him. Which he prevented, by sending a flag of truce, and after some time capitulating, they surrendered themselves prisoners. The colonel took possession of the sloop, and was extremely pleased to find that Captain Thomas, who commanded her, was the individual person of Major Stede Bonnet, who had done them the honor several times to visit their own coast of Carolina. There were killed in this action, on board the Henry, 10 men, and 14 wounded, on board the Sea Nymph, 2 killed and 4 wounded. The officers and sailors in both sloops behaved themselves with the greatest bravery. And had not the sloops so unluckily run aground, they had taken the pirate with much less loss of men, but as he designed to get by them, and so make a running fight, the Carolina sloops were obliged to keep near him, to prevent his getting away. Of the pirates there were 7 killed and 5 wounded, 2 of which died soon after of their wounds. Colonel Rhett waited the 30th of September, from Cape Fear River, and arrived at Charlestown the 3d of October, to the great joy of the whole province of Carolina. Bonnet and his crew, 2 days after, were put ashore, and there not being a public prison, the pirates were kept at the watch-house, under a guard of militia, but Major Bonnet was committed into the custody of the marshal, at his house. And in a few days after, David Harriot the master, and Ignatius Pell the boatswain, who were designed for evidences against the other pirates, were removed from the rest of the crew, to the said marshal's house. And every night 2 sentinels set about the said house. But whether through any corruption, or want of care in guarding the prisoners, I can't say, but on the 24th of October, the Major and Harriet made their escape, the boatswain refusing to go along with them. This made a great noise in the province, and people were open in their resentments, often reflecting on the governor, and others in the magistracy, as though they had been bribed, for conniving at their escape. These invectives arose from their fears, that Bonnet would be capable of raising another company, and prosecute his revenge against this country, for what he had lately, though justly, suffered, but they were in a short time made easy in those respects. For as soon as the governor had the account of Bonnet's escape, he immediately issued out a proclamation, and promised a reward of £700 to any that would take him, and sent several boats with armed men, both to the northward and southward, in pursuit of him. Bonnet stood to the northward, in a small vessel, but wanting necessaries, and the weather being bad, he was forced back, and so returned with his canoe, to Swillivant's Island, near Charlestown, to fetch supplies. But there being some information sent to the governor, he sent for Colonel Rhett, and desired him to go in pursuit of Bonnet. And accordingly gave him a commission for that purpose, wherefore the colonel, with proper craft, and some men, went away that night for Swillivant's Island, and, after a very diligent search, discovered Bonnet and Harriet together. The colonel's men fired upon them, and killed Harriet upon the spot, and wounded 1 negro and an Indian. Bonnet submitted, and surrendered himself. And the next morning, being November the 6th, was brought by Colonel Rhett to Charlestown, and, by the governor's warrant, was committed into safe custody, in order for his being brought to his trial. On the 28th of October, 1718, a court of vice-admiralty was held at Charlestown, in South Carolina, and, by several adjournments, continued to Wednesday, the 12th of November following. For the trial of the pirates taken in a sloop formerly called the Revenge, but afterwards the Royal James, before Nicholas Trott, Esq., Judge of the Vice-Admiralty, and Chief Justice of the said province of South Carolina, and other assistant judges. The King's commission to Judge Trott was read, and a grand jury sworn, for the finding of the several bills, and a learned charge given them by the said judge, wherein he first shewed, that the sea was given by God, for the use of men, and is subject to dominion and property, as well as the land. To delay, he particularly remarked to them, the sovereignty of the King of England over the British seas. 3. Delay, he observed, that as commerce and navigation could not be carried on without laws, so there have been always particular laws, for the better ordering and regulating marine affairs, with an historical account or those laws, and origin. For thly, he proceeded to shew, that there have been particular courts and judges appointed, to whose jurisdiction maritime causes do belong, and that in matters both civil and criminal. And then 5. Thly, he particularly shewed them, the constitution and jurisdiction of that Court of Admiralty Sessions. And lastly, the crimes cognizable therein, and particularly enlarged upon the crime of piracy, which was then brought before them. The indictments being found, a petit jury was sworn, and the following persons arraigned and tried. Stede Bonnet, alias Edwards, alias Thomas, late of Barbados, mariner. Robert Tucker, late of the island of Jamaica, mariner. Edward Robinson, late of Newcastle upon Tyne, mariner. Neil Patterson, late of Aberdeen, mariner. William Scott, late of Aberdeen, mariner. William Eddy, alias Neddy, late of Aberdeen, mariner. Alexander Anand, late of Jamaica, mariner. George Rose, late of Glasgow, mariner. George Duncan, late of Glasgow, mariner. Thomas Nicholas, late of London, mariner. John Ridge, late of London, mariner. Matthew King, late of Jamaica, mariner. Daniel Perry, late of Guernsey, mariner. Henry Virgin, late of Bristol, mariner. James Robbins, alias Rattle, late of London, mariner. James Mullet, alias Millet, late of London, mariner. Thomas Price, late of Bristol, mariner. James Wilson, late of Dublin, mariner. John Lopez, late of Oporto, mariner. Zachariah Long, late of the province of Holland, mariner. Job Bailey, late of London, mariner. John William Smith, late of Charlestown, Carolina, mariner. Thomas Carman, late of Maidstone in Kent, mariner. John Thomas, late of Jamaica, mariner. William Morrison, late of Jamaica, mariner. Samuel Booth, late of Charlestown, mariner. William Hewitt, late of Jamaica, mariner. John Levitt, late of North Carolina, mariner. William Livers, alias Evies. John Brearley, alias Timberhead, late of Bathtown in North Carolina, mariner. Robert Boyd, late of Bathtown aforesaid, mariner. Roland Sharp, of Bathtown, mariner. Jonathan Clark, late of Charlestown, South Carolina, mariner. Thomas Gerard, late of Antigua, mariner. And all, except the three last, and Thomas Nicholas, were found guilty, and received sentence of death. They were most of them tried upon two indictments, as follows. The jurors for our sovereign lord the king, do upon their oath present, that Stede Bonnet, late of Barbados, mariner, Robert Tucker, and the 2d day of August, in the 5th year of the reign of our sovereign lord George, and by force of arms upon the high sea, in a certain place called Cape James, and did piratically, and feloniously set upon, break, board, and enter, a certain merchant sloop, called the Francis, Peter Manwaring commander, by force, and upon the high sea, in a certain place, called Cape James, alias Cape Inlopen, about 2 miles distant from the shore, in the latitude of 39, or thereabouts. And within the jurisdiction of the Court of Vice-Admiralty, of South Carolina, being a sloop of certain persons, to the jurors, unknown, and then, and there, piratically, and feloniously did make an assault, in, and upon the said Peter Manwaring. And others his mariners, whose names to the jurors aforesaid, are unknown, in the same sloop, against the peace of God, and of our said now sovereign lord the king, then, and there being, piratically and feloniously, did put the aforesaid Peter Manwaring, and others, his mariners, of the same sloop, in the sloop aforesaid, then being, in corporal fear of their lives, then and there, in the sloop aforesaid, upon the high sea, in the place aforesaid, called Cape James, alias Cape Inlopen, about 2 miles from the shore, in the latitude of 39, or thereabouts, as aforesaid, and within the jurisdiction aforesaid, piratically, and feloniously, did steal, take, and carry away the said merchant sloop, called the Francis, and also 26 hogsheads, and being found in the aforesaid sloop, in the custody and possession of the said Peter Manwaring, and others, his mariners of the said sloop, and from their custody and possession, then and there, upon the high sea aforesaid, called Cape James, alias Cape Inlopen, as aforesaid, and within the jurisdiction aforesaid, against the peace of our now sovereign lord the king, his crown and dignity. This was the form of the indictments they were arraigned upon, and though they might have proved several more facts upon the major part of the crew, the court thought fit to prosecute but two. The other was for seizing in a piratical and felonious manner, the sloop Fortune, Thomas Reed commander, which indictment running in the same form with the above-mentioned, it will be unnecessary to say more of it. All the prisoners arraigned, pleaded not guilty, and put themselves upon their trials, except James Wilson, and John Levitt, who pleaded guilty to both indictments, and Daniel Perry, to one only. The major would have gone through both the indictments at once, which the court not admitting, he pleaded not guilty to both indictments, but being convicted of one, he retracted his former plea to the second indictment, and pleaded guilty to it. The prisoners made little or no defense, every one pretending only that they were taken off a maroon shore, and were shipped with Major Bonnet to go to St. Thomas's. But being out at sea, and wanting provisions, they were obliged to do what they did by others, and so did Major Bonnet himself, pretend that 'twas force, not inclination, that occasioned what had happened. However, the facts being plainly proved, and that they had all shared 10 or 11 pounds a man, excepting the three last, and Thomas Nichols, they were all but they, found guilty. The judge made a very grave speech to them, setting forth the enormity of their crimes, the condition they were now in, and the nature and necessity of an unfeigned repentance. And then recommended them to the ministers of the province, for more ample directions, to fit them for eternity, for, concluded he, the priest's lips shall keep knowledge, and you shall seek the law at their mouths. For they are the messengers of the Lord. Matt. 2:57. And the ambassadors of Christ, and unto them is committed the word, or doctrine, of reconciliation, 2 Cor v. 19. 20, and then pronounced sentence of death upon them. On Saturday, November the 8th, 1711. Robert Tucker, Edward Robinson, Neil Patterson, William Scott, Job Bailey, John William Smith, John Thomas, William Morrison, Samuel Booth, William Hewitt, William Eddy, alias Neddy, Alexander Anand, George Ross, George Duncan, Matthew King. Daniel Perry, Henry Virgin, James Robbins, James Mullet, alias Millet, Thomas Price, John Lopez, and Zachariah Long, were executed at the White Point near Charlestown, pursuant to their sentence. As for the captain, his escape protracted his fate, and spun out his life a few days longer, for he was tried the 10th, and being found guilty, received sentence in like manner as the former. Before which Judge Trott made a most excellent speech to him, rather somewhat too long to be taken into our history, yet I could not tell how to pass by so good and useful a piece of instruction. Not knowing whose hands this book may happen to fall into. The Lord Chief Justice's speech, upon his pronouncing sentence on Major Stede Bonnet. Major Stede Bonnet, you stand here convicted upon 2 indictments of piracy, one by the verdict of the jury, and the other by your own confession. Although you were indicted but for 2 facts, yet you know that at your trial it was fully proved even by an unwilling witness, that you piratically took and rifled no less than 13 vessels, since you sailed from North Carolina. So that you might have been indicted, and convicted of 11 more acts of piracy, since you took the benefit of the King's Act of Grace, and pretended to leave that wicked course of life. Not to mention the many acts of piracy you committed before. For which if your pardon from man was never so authentic, yet you must expect to answer for them before God. You know that the crimes you have committed are evil in themselves, and contrary to the light and law of nature, as well as the law of God, by which you are commanded that you shall not steal, Exodus 20:15, and the Apostle St. Paul expressly affirms, that thieves shall not inherit the kingdom of God, 1 Cor 6:10. But to theft you have added a greater sin, which is murder. How many you may have killed of those that resisted you in the committing your former piracies, I know not, but this we all know, that besides the wounded, you killed no less than 18 persons out of those that were sent by lawful authority to suppress you, and put a stop to those rapines that you daily acted. And however you may fancy that that was killing men fairly in open fight, yet this know, that the power of the sword not being committed into your hands by any lawful authority, you were not empowered to use any force, or fight any one. And therefore those persons that fell in that action, in doing their duty to their king and country, were murdered, and their blood now cries out for vengeance and justice against you, for it is the voice of nature, confirmed by the law of God. That whosoever sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. Gen 9. 6. And consider that death is not the only punishment due to murderers, for they are threatened to have their part in the lake which burneth with fire and brimstone, which is the second death, Rev 21. 8, see chapter 22. 15. Words which carry that terror with them, that considering your circumstances and your guilt, surely the sound of them must make you tremble, for who can dwell with everlasting burnings? Chapter 33. 14. As the testimony of your conscience must convince you of the great and many evils you have committed, by which you have highly offended God, and provoked most justly his wrath and indignation against you. So I suppose I need not tell you that the only way of obtaining pardon and remission of your sins from God, is by a true and unfeigned repentance and faith in Christ, by whose meritorious death and passion, you can only hope for salvation. You being a gentleman that have had the advantage of a liberal education, and being generally esteemed a man of letters, I believe it will be needless for me to explain to you the nature of repentance and faith in Christ. They being so fully and so often mentioned in the Scriptures, that you cannot but know them. And therefore, perhaps, for that reason it might be thought by some improper for me to have said so much to you, as I have already upon this occasion. Neither should I have done it, but that considering the course of your life and actions, I have just reason to fear, that the principles of religion that have been instilled into you by your education, have been at least corrupted, if not entirely defaced, by the skepticism and infidelity of this wicked age. And that what time you allowed for study, was rather applied to the polite literature, and the vain philosophy of the times, than a serious search after the law and will of God, as revealed unto us in the Holy Scriptures. For had your delight been in the law of the Lord, and that you had meditated therein day and night, Saul 1, 2. You would then have found that God's word was a lamp unto your feet, and a light to your path, Saul 1:19, 105. And that you would account all other knowledge but loss, in comparison of the excellency of the knowledge of Christ Jesus, Phil 3. 8, who to them that are called is the power of God, and the wisdom of God, 1 Cor 1. 24, even the hidden wisdom which God ordained before the world, chapter 2. 7. You would then have esteemed the Scriptures as the great charter of heaven, and which delivered to us not only the most perfect laws and rules of life, but also discovered to us the acts of pardon from God, wherein they have offended those righteous laws, for in them only is to be found the great mystery of fallen man's redemption, which the angels desire to look into, 1 Pet. 1, 12. And they would have taught you that sin is the debasing of human nature, as being a derivation from that purity, rectitude, and holiness, in which God created us, and that virtue and religion, and walking by the laws of God, were altogether preferable to the ways of sin and Satan. For that the ways of virtue are ways of pleasantness, and all their paths are peace, Pyrates 3. 17. But what you could not learn from God's word, by reason of your carously, or but superficially considering the same, I hope the course of his providence, and the present afflictions that he hath laid upon you, hath now convinced you of the same, for however in your seeming prosperity you might make a mock at your sins. Prov. 3, 17. Yet now that you see that God's hand hath reached you, and brought you to public justice, I hope your present unhappy circumstances hath made you seriously reflect upon your past actions and course of life, and that you are now sensible of the greatness of your sins, and that you find the burden of them is intolerable. And that therefore being thus laboring, and heavy laden with sin, Matt. 11, 28. You will esteem that as the most valuable knowledge, that can shew you how you can be reconciled to that supreme God that you have so highly offended. And that can reveal to you him who is not only the powerful advocate with the Father for you, 1 John 2. 1, but also who hath paid that debt that is due for your sins by his own death upon the cross for you, and thereby made full satisfaction for the justice of God. And this is to be found nowhere but in God's word, which discovers to us that Lamb of God which takes away the sins of the world, John 1:29. Which is Christ the Son of God, for this know, and be assured, that there is none other name under heaven given among men, whereby we must be saved, Acts 4:12, but only by the name of the Lord Jesus. But then consider how he invites all sinners to come unto him, and, that he will give them rest, Matt 11:28, for he assures us, that he came to seek and to save that which was lost, Luke 19:10, Matt 18:11. And hath promised, that he that cometh unto him, he will in no wise cast out, John 6:37. So that if now you will sincerely turn to him, though late, even at the 11th hour, Matt 26:9. He will receive you. But surely I need not tell you, that the terms of his mercy is faith and repentance.